Hello everyone, I am Mr. Midnight. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. On a quiet summer night in July 2007, the peaceful town of Cheshire, Connecticut, became the scene of one of the most horrific crimes in American history. What began as a chance encounter at a supermarket would escalate into a 7-hour nightmare that claimed 3 innocent lives and exposed devastating failures in the criminal justice system. This is the story of the Petit family, a story of unimaginable terror, survival, and a community forever changed. But it's also a story that forces us to confront difficult questions about repeat offenders, parole systems, and whether justice was truly served. The Petit family represented the American dream. Dr. William Petit, Jr., was a respected endocrinologist who had practiced in Plainville, Connecticut since 1989. Born on September 24, 1956 in Southampton, Connecticut, William grew up in a family deeply involved in their community. His father ran a general store and served on the school board and town council. After graduating from Dartmouth College, William attended the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, where his life would change forever. In 1985, while working as a third-year medical student at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, he met Jennifer Hawk, a new oncology nurse at the same hospital. Their connection was immediate, and they married on April 13, 1985 in Melville, Pennsylvania. Jennifer, born September 26, 1958 in Morristown, New Jersey, brought warmth and dedication to everything she did. She became the co-director of the health center at Cheshire Academy, a private boarding school where she was beloved by students and staff. Despite being diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, Jennifer never let her condition define her. Instead, she turned it into a cause that would inspire her entire family. The Pattis had 2 daughters who were the pride of their lives. Haley Elizabeth, born October 15, 1989, was 17 years old in the summer of 2007. She had just graduated from the prestigious Miss Porter School in Farmington, where she excelled in everything she touched. Haley ran varsity cross-country, played basketball and crew, maintained a spot on the high honor roll, and was elected Athletic Association head, a senior leadership position. She had been accepted to Dartmouth College, her father's alma mater, where she planned to study medicine and continue the family legacy of service. But Haley's greatest passion was fighting multiple sclerosis in honor of her mother. She captained a walk MS team called Haley's Hope and won a school award for exceptional community service. Her dedication to this cause would become part of her lasting legacy. 11-year-old Michaela Rose Patty, born November 17, 1995, was the family's creative spirit. She attended Chase Collegiate School in Waterbury and loved cooking, often preparing elaborate meals for her family. On July 22, 2007, she went shopping with her mother to buy ingredients for a special dinner she planned to cook that evening. Michaela had already decided that when Haley left for college, she would take over the MS fundraising team and rename it Michaela's Miracle. The Pat were deeply embedded in their community. Their home on Sarah Mill Road in Cheshire was a place of warmth, achievement, and hope. They had built a life that many would envy. Successful careers, bright children, and a strong commitment to making the world better. But unknown to them, they had been noticed by 2 men who would destroy everything they had built. Joshua Komisarski was 26 years old in 2007, with a history of burglary convictions and drug abuse. Born on August 10, 1980, he had been adopted by Ben and Jude Komisarski into a family with deep ties to the arts. His grandfather was the renowned theater director Theodore Komisarski, but Joshua's life had taken a dark turn. He had spent years in and out of the criminal justice system, and by July 2007, he was on parole. Stephen Hayes, 44 years old, had an even longer criminal record dating back to a burglary conviction in 1981 when he was still a teenager. Born on May 30th, 1963, Hayes had spent much of his adult life cycling through the prison system. Court documents would later reveal a disturbing pattern of cruelty that began in childhood, including severe abuse toward his younger brother. The two men had met through a halfway house drug treatment program. Both were supposed to be under supervision, monitored by the parole system designed to protect the public. But on July 22, 2007, they were free to walk the streets of Cheshire, planning their next crime. Music, Sunday evening, July 22, 2007, seemed like any other summer day. Jennifer Patty took 11-year-old Michaela to a local supermarket. Michaela was excited about the special dinner she planned to cook for her family. As they shopped for ingredients, they had no idea they were being watched. Joshua Kamaski spotted them in the store. Later testimony and trial evidence would reveal that he followed Jennifer and Mika from the supermarket back to their home on Sorghum Mill Road. He observed the family, their routine, their beautiful home. He saw opportunity. He saw targets. That evening, Komisarski contacted Stephen Hayes. At 7:45 p.m., Hayes sent a chilling text message. "I'm chomping at the bit to get started. Need a margarita soon." Over the next hour and a half, between 8:45 p.m. and 9:20 p.m., the two men exchanged texts that prosecutors would later use as evidence of premeditation. They were joking, planning, anticipating what they were about to do. Police later reported that the pair may have even gone shopping for implements, an air rifle, and rope after seeing the girls at the supermarket. They were methodically preparing for a home invasion. The Pat family went to sleep that night with no idea that two violent criminals had marked them for destruction. Music. The exact timing of the initial entry remains somewhat disputed in official records. A Connecticut Supreme Court summary places the entry at around 2:00 a.m. on Monday, July 23rd. Other police reports and contemporaneous news coverage describe the break-in as occurring shortly after 3:00 a.m. What is clear is that Hayes and Kamaski entered the Patty home in the early morning darkness. Dr. William Patty was sleeping on a couch on the first floor, having dozed off after watching television. He was suddenly awakened by a devastating blow to his head with a baseball bat they had found in the home. The attack was brutal and immediate. William was dragged to the basement, disoriented and bleeding. The intruders bound him with rope and pillowcases, ensuring he couldn't escape or call for help. They beat him repeatedly. Later medical evidence would document severe injuries, head trauma, facial fractures, and extensive bruising. But somehow William remained conscious, trapped in his own basement while the nightmare unfolded upstairs. Jennifer and the two girls were herded into their bedrooms and tied to their beds. The intruders told them this was just a robbery, that if everyone cooperated, no one would be hurt. It was a lie that would be repeated throughout the ordeal. A cruel psychological tactic to maintain control, while they methodically planned something far more sinister. For approximately 6 to 7 hours, the Pat family endured unimaginable terror. The intruders ransacked the house, searching for valuables, credit cards, bank information. They demanded to know where money was kept, what accounts the family had access to. All the while, they kept the family separated, bound, and terrified. At some point during this period, Stephen Hayes left the house and went to a nearby gas station. Surveillance video captured him purchasing $10 worth of gasoline in containers taken from the petite garage. This wasn't for a getaway vehicle. It was for something far more horrific. As morning broke on July 23rd, the situation escalated into its most critical phase. The intruders had decided to force Jennifer to go to the bank and withdraw money. It was around 9:00 a.m. when Stephen Hayes drove Jennifer to the Bank of America on Mapleroft Plaza in Cheshire, holding her hostage in her own vehicle. Jennifer knew she was in grave danger. She knew her family was being held in the home, but she also saw an opportunity to get help. When she entered the bank, she managed to communicate to bank personnel that something was desperately wrong. The bank manager immediately recognized the danger Jennifer was in. At 9:21 a.m., while Jennifer was still at or near the teller window, the bank manager called 911. He tracked Jennifer's movements in real time, updating the dispatcher as she completed the forced withdrawal. At 9:25 a.m., the dispatcher relayed critical details to a supervising officer. 1 minute later, at 9:26 a.m., a broadcast went out to all Cheshire police units with vehicle information and the license plate number. The wheels of law enforcement were now in motion. Police were dispatched toward both the bank area and the Petite residence. But for the family trapped inside the house, time was running out. When Hayes returned to the house with Jennifer and the withdrawn money, the situation inside had already deteriorated beyond imagination. While Hayes had been at the bank, Kamaski had assaulted Michaela. He had taken explicit photographs with his cell phone, evidence that would later be crucial in proving the depraved nature of these crimes. Jennifer was also assaulted. The medical examiner would later confirm that both mother and youngest daughter had been victimized in the most horrific ways possible. The intruders had never intended to simply rob the family and leave. They had planned something far more permanent. The men knew police were likely coming. The bank manager's call had started a countdown they couldn't stop. Rather than flee and abandon their victims alive, Hayes and Kamaski made a decision that would seal their fate as two of the most hated criminals in Connecticut history. They doused the house with the gasoline Hayes had purchased. They poured it around the beds where Haley and Michaela lay tied and helpless. Then they set the house on fire. Jennifer Hawk Patty, 48 years old, didn't die in the flames. She was strangled to death, a final act of violence before the fire could consume her. Her daughters, 17-year-old Haley and 11-year-old Michaela, died from smoke inhalation as the flames spread rapidly through the home. They were conscious when the fire started. They knew they were going to die. In the basement, Dr. William Patty was still bound but conscious. The smell of smoke filtered down to him. He could hear the sounds above. Summoning strength he didn't know he had despite his severe injuries, William managed to free himself from his restraints. He crawled to a basement window, kicked it open, and escaped to a neighbor's yard. He collapsed on their porch, bloody and barely conscious, but alive. Cheshire police arrived at the Petite residence to a scene of chaos. The house was visibly burning. Just as they arrived, they saw two men exit the house and get into a vehicle in the driveway. These were Hayes and Kamaski attempting to flee the scene of their crimes. What happened next unfolded in seconds. The suspects started the vehicle and began to back out. Police moved to block their exit. Rather than surrender, the suspects rammed their vehicle into multiple police cruisers, trying desperately to escape, but the collisions disabled their vehicle. They were trapped. At gunpoint, both Stephen Hayes and Joshua Kamaski were taken into custody. They were arrested at the scene while firefighters rushed to battle the blaze consuming the Petite home. When firefighters finally suppressed the fire and could safely enter, they discovered what everyone had feared. 3 bodies were found inside. Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela had all perished. The only survivor was Dr. William Patty, who had been transported to the hospital with life-threatening injuries. Music, Multiple scenes had to be secured. The bank where Jennifer had made her desperate silent plea for help, the burning home where 3 women had died, and the collision site where the suspects had been arrested. The Cheshire Police Department, Connecticut State Police Central District Major Crime Squad, and the State Fire Marshal's Office all responded to what had become one of the most heinous crimes in Connecticut history. The investigation that followed built an overwhelming case against both perpetrators. Text messages between Hayes and Kamaski from the night before the crime showed clear premeditation. Their joking anticipatory messages about getting started demolished any defense that this had been a burglary that spontaneously escalated. The cell phone belonging to Joshua Komisarski contained photographs that were almost too disturbing to describe. Digital images showed the victims bound and included explicit photos of the assault of Michaela. Technology expert John Farnham testified about these images at trial, and they became crucial evidence linking Komisarski directly to the assault charges. Bank surveillance video showed Hayes with Jennifer during the forced withdrawal. Gas station surveillance showed Hayes purchasing the gasoline shortly before the arson. The timeline was airtight. Medical examiner Wayne Carver provided testimony about the causes of death. Jennifer had been strangled. Haley and Michaela had died from smoke inhalation. Their bodies found in their burned beds where they had been tied. The physical evidence from the fire scene showed ropes, restraints, and the accelerant patterns that proved arson. Perhaps most damning, laboratory officials testified that blood samples showed neither Hayes nor Karfsky had alcohol or illegal drugs in their systems. There was no intoxication defense. They had been completely aware of their actions. On Tuesday, July 24, 2007, just 1 day after the murders, both suspects were arraigned in Meriden Superior Court. The state announced charges including kidnapping, burglary, arson, robbery, larceny, and assault. Each was held on $15 million bond. By Thursday, July 26, 2007, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. Both men were formally charged with 6 capital felony counts, charges that made them eligible for execution under Connecticut law at the time. Stephen Hayes went a trial first. His trial began on September 13, 2010, more than 3 years after the crime. On October 5, 2010, the jury found him guilty on all counts. On November 8, 2010, the jury recommended the death penalty. On December 2, 2010, Judge John Blue formally sentenced Hayes to death. Music. Joshua Komisarski's trial began on September 19, 2011. On September 22, jurors heard his recorded confession. On September 28, they saw the text messages and heard medical examiner testimony about evidence of Michaela's assault. His defense team presented evidence of the abuse Kamaski had suffered, hoping for mitigation in sentencing. The jury was unmoved. Kamaski was also found guilty and sentenced to death. Both men would sit on Connecticut's death row, their appeals dragging through the courts while Dr. William Patty tried to rebuild a shattered life. The Patty murders became a watershed moment for Connecticut. On July 28, 2007, just 5 days after the murders, thousands attended a memorial service where Dr. William Patty eulogized his family. A community gathered at Central Connecticut State University to mourn 3 lives taken too soon. In the months that followed, the outpouring of support was extraordinary. On January 6, 2008, the Cheshire Lights of Hope event saw more than 130,000 luminaria candles lit in memory of Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela. The Petite Family Foundation was established to continue the charitable work, especially the MS advocacy that had meant so much to the family. Then came an unexpected turn. On April 25, 2012, Connecticut enacted legislation that prospectively repealed the death penalty for crimes committed on or after that date. The new law didn't affect Hayes and Kamaski, whose crimes had occurred in 2007. They remained on death row. But in 2015, the Connecticut Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling in a case called State versus Santiago. The court held that executing prisoners for crimes committed before the 2012 repeal would constitute cruel and unusual punishment under the Connecticut State Constitution. All death sentences were to be converted to life imprisonment without the possibility of release. In June 2016, Stephen Hayes was resentenced by Judge John Blue to 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of release, plus an additional 106 years on related charges. Judge Blue's words at resentencing were final and absolute. With the gravity of these crimes and the depravity of your character, nothing more needs to be said. On July 26, 2016, Joshua Kamaski received the same sentence, 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of release. Both men will die in prison. There will be no parole hearings, no chances for release, no possibility of freedom. The Cheshire Home invasion stands as one of the most brutal crimes in American history. It exposed failures in the parole system, sparked debates about the death penalty, and left a community forever scarred. But perhaps more importantly, it showed us the preciousness of life and the devastating consequences when evil goes unchecked. Dr. William Patty survived physically, but he lost everything that mattered most. In the years following the tragedy, he has shown remarkable resilience. He has since remarried and had children, working tirelessly to honor his first family's memory through continued charitable work. The Petite Family Foundation continues to support causes that were dear to Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela, particularly in the areas of education and multiple sclerosis research. William has become a powerful advocate for victims' rights and criminal justice reform. He has testified before legislative committees, spoken at conferences, and worked with lawmakers to strengthen parole supervision and improve the criminal justice system's ability to protect the public. His advocacy helped shape Connecticut's response to violent crime, including stricter parole guidelines and enhanced monitoring of repeat offenders. The parole board faced intense scrutiny. Questions arose about risk assessment, supervision protocols, and whether warning signs had been missed or ignored. The case became a catalyst for reform with new legislation passed to tighten parole requirements, increase supervision of high-risk offenders, and provide better training for parole officers in identifying dangerous behavior patterns. The death penalty debate that followed the Connecticut Supreme Court's 2015 ruling was equally contentious. Many victims' rights advocates, including Dr. Patty himself, believed that Hayes and Kamaski deserved execution. They argued that the brutality of the crimes warranted the ultimate punishment, and that converting their death sentences to life imprisonment represented a failure of justice. Others saw the Connecticut Supreme Court's decision as a principled stand against capital punishment, regardless of the heinousness of the crime. The court reasoned that once Connecticut had decided the death penalty was wrong going forward, it would be inconsistent and cruel to continue executing prisoners for older crimes. The debate continues to this day, with the Pat serving as the primary example used by both sides. Jennifer Haley and Michaela Patty were extraordinary people whose lives were stolen by 2 men who chose violence, cruelty, and murder. Jennifer was more than a nurse and a mother. She was a caregiver who touched countless lives at Cheshire Academy. Students remembered her kindness, her dedication, and her ability to make everyone feel cared for, even as she battled her own illness. Haley was on the cusp of greatness. Her acceptance to Dartmouth, her athletic achievements, her leadership roles, All pointed to a young woman who would have made significant contributions to society. Her dedication to MS fundraising showed a maturity and compassion beyond her years. The world lost not just a bright student, but a future leader in medicine and advocacy. Michaela, at just 11 years old, had already shown the creativity and warmth that would have defined her life. Her love of cooking, her eagerness to take over her sister's fundraising work, her excitement about starting middle school. These were the dreams of a child whose future was limitless. That future was stolen in the most horrific way imaginable. They deserved to grow old to achieve their dreams, to make their mark on the world. Instead, they became symbols, reminders that evil exists, that vigilance matters, and that justice, though sometimes imperfect, must always strive to protect the innocent. Story 2. On a quiet winter morning in January 2015, the peaceful city of Long Beach, California, awoke to news that would shake an entire nation. What first appeared to be a routine welfare check would soon unravel into one of the most disturbing family annihilation cases in modern American history. A case that exposed deception hiding behind wealth, education, and charm. A case that forced investigators, psychologists, and the public to confront an unsettling truth. Sometimes the most dangerous monsters wear the most convincing masks. This is the story of the Coleman family. A story of ambition, betrayal, and a crime so calculated that its shockwaves are still felt today. The Coleman family seemed to embody success. They lived in a modern luxury condominium overlooking the marina in Long Beach. Their social media accounts displayed international travel, elegant dinners, and smiling faces. To friends and neighbors, they were the picture of a modern, accomplished American family. At the center of it all was Dr. Gregory Coleman, a man whose resume alone commanded respect. He was a physician, an academic, and a biotech entrepreneur. Intelligent, articulate, and confident, Gregory appeared to be everything society rewards. Gregory Scott Coleman was born on May 12, 1971, in Newport Beach, California. Raised in an upper-middle-class household, he excelled academically from a young age. Teachers described him as driven and competitive. He graduated near the top of his class in high school and went on to attend the University of California, Irvine, where he earned a degree in biological sciences. From there, Gregory was accepted into medical school, eventually becoming a licensed physician specializing in pain management. But medicine alone was never enough for him. Gregory wanted more than professional success. He wanted status, admiration, and recognition. That ambition followed him into adulthood. In addition to practicing medicine, Gregory became involved in biotech startups, presenting himself as a visionary innovator. He frequently spoke about revolutionary treatments, investment opportunities, and future breakthroughs. He cultivated the image of a man on the brink of greatness, and many believed him. By Gregory's side was his wife, Rachel Coleman, a woman whose quiet strength balanced Gregory's intensity. Rachel Ann Coleman was born on August 3, 1974, in San Diego, California. She grew up in a close-knit family that valued honesty, compassion, and hard work. Unlike Gregory, Rachel was not driven by prestige. She pursued a career in education, earning a degree in early childhood development. Friends described her as warm, patient, and deeply devoted to her family. Rachel and Gregory met in the early 2000s through mutual friends. Gregory was immediately drawn to Rachel's kindness and stability. Rachel, in turn, admired Gregory's intelligence and confidence. They married in 2004, and from the outside, their relationship appeared loving and supportive. Rachel became the emotional anchor of the family, the one who kept their home grounded amid Gregory's ever-expanding ambitions. Together, they had 3 children, each of whom became the center of Rachel's world. Their eldest, Ethan Coleman, was born on February 14, 2007. A bright and curious child, Ethan loved books, puzzles, and asking endless questions about how things worked. Teachers at his elementary school noted his advanced reading level and gentle nature. He was the type of child who comforted classmates when they were upset and always tried to do the right thing. Their second child, Lily Coleman, was born on June 9, 2009. Lily was creative and expressive, with a love for drawing and music. She filled notebooks with colorful sketches and dreamed of becoming an artist someday. Rachel often shared stories of Lily's imagination, describing her as the family's light. The youngest, Noah Coleman, was born on November 21, 2011. Still a toddler in 2015, Noah was energetic and affectionate, constantly seeking attention and laughter. He adored his older siblings and followed them everywhere. To Rachel, her children were everything. She structured her entire life around their safety, happiness, and future. The Coleman household, at least outwardly, was stable. Rachel handled most of the parenting responsibilities while Gregory worked long hours, traveled frequently, and spoke about business deals that promised enormous returns. The family's lifestyle reflected apparent financial success. Luxury vehicles, expensive furniture, and vacations abroad reinforced the illusion that Gregory's ventures were thriving. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Behind closed doors, Gregory's professional life was unraveling. Several of his biotech projects had failed to deliver results. Investors were growing impatient. Financial records would later reveal mounting debt, unpaid loans, and falsified claims about company performance. Gregory was running out of time, money, and credibility. At the same time, his marriage was deteriorating. Rachel had begun questioning Gregory's constant absences and vague explanations. She noticed inconsistencies in his stories and grew concerned about their finances. Bank statements no longer aligned with the lifestyle Gregory insisted they could afford. Tension crept into their once calm home. Friends later recalled that Rachel confided in them about her worries. She loved Gregory, but she was no longer sure she trusted him. She spoke about wanting honesty, stability, and a future built on truth rather than appearances. What Rachel didn't know was that Gregory had already begun constructing an exit plan. And in his mind, that plan did not include his family. In the months leading up to January 2015, Gregory started living a double life. While presenting himself publicly as a devoted husband and father, he was secretly pursuing relationships outside his marriage. One woman in particular believed Gregory was separated and preparing for a fresh start. To her, he spoke of a future free from responsibility, unburdened by financial and familial ties. Meanwhile, Rachel was making plans of her own. She had begun documenting Gregory's inconsistencies, saving messages, and organizing financial paperwork. She spoke to a lawyer about the possibility of divorce. Her intention was not revenge but protection. She wanted to safeguard her children. Gregory sensed that control was slipping away, and for a man obsessed with image and dominance, that loss of control was intolerable. January 2015 arrived quietly. On the surface, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The Coleman children attended school. Rachel maintained her daily routine. Gregory continued to present himself as busy and important. No one outside the family suspected what was coming. On the evening of January 19th, neighbors later recalled seeing lights on in the Coleman condominium. Nothing unusual, no raised voices, no signs of distress. Just another family night in a city filled with thousands of similar households. But sometime during the night, something changed. When Rachel failed to respond to messages the following morning, concern began to grow. She was known for being reliable, attentive, and communicative. Missing appointments and unanswered calls were out of character. By midday on January 20th, a family member contacted authorities and requested a welfare check. Police arrived at the luxury condominium expecting nothing more than a minor domestic issue. Perhaps someone was sick. Perhaps phones were turned off. They had no reason to anticipate the scene waiting behind the door. When officers entered the residence, they were immediately struck by the silence. The air was heavy. As they moved further inside, they began discovering bodies. Rachel was found first. Then the children. One by one, every member of the Coleman family lay lifeless inside the home. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle that suggested an intruder. The home was pristine, eerily calm, as though time had frozen. And Gregory Coleman was nowhere to be found. As news broke of the discovery, the case exploded across media outlets. A successful doctor, a beautiful family, 3 young children, all dead. The public immediately demanded answers. Investigators were now faced with a chilling reality. Whoever committed this crime had access, trust, and time. And the person who seemed the most unlikely suspect was quickly becoming the most obvious. What police would uncover next would dismantle the carefully constructed image Gregory Coleman had spent his entire life building. And as the truth emerged, it would reveal not a crime of passion, but a calculated decision driven by ego, greed, and a desire to erase responsibility entirely. As investigators secured the Coleman condominium, the initial shock gave way to methodical urgency. This was no chaotic crime scene. There were no broken windows, no overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle that would suggest an outside intruder. Everything about the scene pointed inward, towards someone who belonged there. Rachel Coleman was found in the master bedroom. Her body showed no defensive wounds. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been sedated before her death. The children were discovered in their own rooms, tucked into their beds as if they had been put to sleep. Toxicology reports would later confirm the presence of prescription sedatives in all 3 children. Whoever had done this had taken time. Whoever had done this had planned. The realization settled quickly among detectives. This was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was deliberate, controlled, and chillingly organized. As crime scene technicians documented every detail, officers began the next critical step, locating Gregory Coleman. His phone went straight to voicemail. His vehicle was missing from the garage. There were no recent credit card transactions, no hotel bookings, no flight records under his name. Within hours, Gregory was officially listed as a person of interest. Detectives turned their attention to the family's digital footprint. Rachel's phone told a story of growing concern. Messages to friends hinted at fear, confusion, and a sense that something wasn't right. She had been asking questions, asking for advice, asking for help. In contrast, Gregory's communications revealed something else entirely. His messages were cold, transactional, and increasingly detached from his family. One conversation, recovered from his phone records, showed Gregory assuring a romantic partner that he would soon be free and that his complications would be resolved. At the time, the recipient believed he was referring to a pending divorce. Investigators now viewed those words through a far darker lens. Financial records added another layer. Gregory's biotech ventures were collapsing. Bank accounts were overdrawn. Loans were coming due. Investors were demanding answers. Lawsuits were imminent. Gregory was facing not just financial ruin, but professional exposure. His carefully cultivated image as a brilliant physician entrepreneur was on the brink of total destruction. To someone like Gregory, whose identity was built on admiration and control, that collapse was unbearable. Surveillance footage from nearby streets placed Gregory's car leaving the condominium complex in the early hours of January 20th. The timestamp aligned with the estimated time of death. He drove calmly. No erratic behavior, no signs of panic. It was the behavior of someone executing a plan, not fleeing a mistake. Police issued a statewide alert, then a nationwide one. Gregory Coleman was now the subject of a manhunt. As the search intensified, investigators reconstructed Gregory's final days with disturbing clarity. In the week before the murders, he had canceled future appointments, transferred small sums of money between accounts, deleted emails. He had researched sedative dosages online, including searches related to pediatric administration. These weren't impulsive acts, they were rehearsals. Psychological profilers were brought in. Their assessment was grim. Gregory displayed classic traits of malignant narcissism, grandiosity, lack of empathy, a belief that his needs outweighed the lives of others. When faced with exposure and loss of control, such individuals may choose annihilation over accountability. To Gregory, his family had ceased to be people. They had become obstacles. As public outrage grew, the media descended on Long Beach. News anchors dissected Gregory's career. Former colleagues spoke of his arrogance. Others admitted they had always sensed something off about him. The image of the devoted father began to crumble under scrutiny. 3 days after the murders, a break came from hundreds of miles away. On January 23, 2015, a park ranger at Joshua Tree National Park noticed a vehicle parked near a remote trailhead. Inside was a man matching Gregory Coleman's description. He appeared disoriented, dehydrated, and emotionally flat. When approached, he initially identified himself under a different name. But fingerprints confirmed his identity within minutes. Gregory Coleman was alive. He was taken into custody without resistance. During the drive to the station, he asked only one question: "Are they all dead?" When the officer responded yes, Gregory closed his eyes and said nothing more. Interrogators later described his demeanor as unsettlingly calm. He did not ask about his children. He did not express grief. He did not cry. He spoke instead about stress, pressure, and betrayal. He framed himself as the victim of circumstances, of expectations, of people who didn't understand him. When confronted with evidence, Gregory did not deny his actions. Instead, he rationalized them. He claimed he wanted to spare his family from humiliation, from poverty, from watching him fall from grace. In his mind, he had acted mercifully. This justification horrified even seasoned detectives. As news of his arrest broke, public reaction shifted from shock to rage. Vigils were held for Rachel, Ethan, Lily, and Noah. Candles lined sidewalks outside the condominium. Parents across the country hugged their children tighter. The idea that a father could so methodically destroy his own family forced a collective reckoning. But for investigators, the case was far from over. They now had to prove premeditation beyond doubt, to show that Gregory's actions were not the result of temporary insanity, but a calculated effort to erase responsibility and start anew. Every text message, every search query, every financial transaction would matter. And as prosecutors began assembling their case, they realized something even more disturbing. Gregory hadn't planned to disappear forever. Evidence suggested he believed he could eventually reinvent himself, perhaps even claim victimhood, portraying the murders as a tragic loss he had somehow survived. The depth of his delusion was staggering. In the days that followed, charges were formally filed. 4 counts of first-degree murder, special circumstances due to multiple victims and the murder of children. Prosecutors announced they would seek life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Gregory Coleman, once admired and respected, now sat alone in a jail cell, stripped of his titles, his status, and his carefully constructed identity. But the question that lingered wasn't whether he was guilty. It was how someone so outwardly successful could harbor such darkness, undetected, until it was far too late. Gregory Coleman's trial began 18 months after the murders. delayed by extensive pretrial motions, psychological evaluations, and the sheer volume of evidence. By the time opening statements were delivered, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Media outlets from across the country filled the gallery. True crime observers, legal analysts, and grieving community members sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting to understand how a man with everything had chosen annihilation over accountability. Prosecutors opened with a simple statement. This was not a crime of passion, insanity, or desperation. This was a crime of control. They walked the jury through the timeline with surgical precision. Financial collapse, marital strain, a secret relationship, digital searches for sedatives, deleted emails, a calm, methodical departure. Each element stacked atop the other until the conclusion felt unavoidable. Gregory Coleman had planned the murders long before he carried them out. The defense did not dispute that Gregory had caused the deaths. Instead, they argued diminished capacity. They painted a picture of a man under unbearable pressure, a victim of depression, narcissistic injury, and emotional overload. Expert witnesses testified that Gregory suffered from severe personality dysfunction, that his ability to empathize had been impaired by stress and fear of failure. But the prosecution countered with their own experts, and their testimony was devastating. Psychologists explained that Gregory did not act impulsively. His behavior before and after the murders demonstrated clear executive functioning. He researched dosages. He sedated his victims carefully to avoid resistance. He cleaned the scene. He fled with supplies. He attempted to conceal his identity. These were not the actions of a man disconnected from reality. These were the actions of someone making choices. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from digital forensic analysts. They reconstructed Gregory's internet searches in the days leading up to the murders. Among them were searches about inheritance law, custody outcomes in divorce, and how long sedatives remain detectable in toxicology screenings. Jurors sat in stunned silence as the evidence unfolded. One juror would later say that this was the moment the defense lost the case. When Gregory took the stand in his own defense, the effect was chilling. He spoke calmly, eloquently, and at length about betrayal, disappointment, and pressure. He referred to his family not as people but as responsibilities. He described his children's deaths as unavoidable consequences of a system that he believed had cornered him. At no point did he apologize. At no point did he express grief. The prosecution's cross-examination was brief and devastating. They asked Gregory if he had considered calling for help. He said no. They asked if he had considered divorce. He said it would have ruined his reputation. They asked if he had considered leaving alone. He said that would have left loose ends. Loose ends. That phrase echoed through the courtroom long after he stepped down. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 days. Their verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. When the judge read the verdict, there was no outburst, no collapse. Gregory simply nodded, as though confirming a decision he had always expected. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date, but the outcome was never in doubt. At sentencing, family members of Rachel Coleman were allowed to speak. Her sister described Rachel as someone who loved fiercely and trusted deeply. A woman who believed marriage was sacred and who had tried desperately to hold her family together. Friends spoke of her kindness, her patience, her quiet strength. Photographs of the children were displayed. Birthday parties, school plays, soccer games, ordinary moments that now felt impossibly distant. The judge addressed Gregory directly. He spoke of choice, of responsibility, of the irreversible harm inflicted not only on one family but on an entire community. He rejected the defense's narrative of victimhood, stating that stress does not excuse slaughter and ego does not justify annihilation. Gregory Coleman was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As he was led away, he looked once toward the gallery. There was no recognition, no remorse. Only a blank expression, as though the world had finally stopped demanding something from him. In the months that followed, Long Beach struggled to process what had happened. The Coleman condominium was sold. Neighbors moved away. A memorial plaque was placed near the shoreline, bearing the names Rachel, Ethan, Lily, and Noah. People left flowers, toys, handwritten notes from strangers who said they would never forget. The case sparked national conversation about family annihilators, a category of crime often misunderstood and underreported. Experts began pointing out patterns that had been ignored for too long. Financial stress combined with narcissism, fear of exposure, a desire to control narrative and legacy, the belief that others exist as extensions of oneself rather than independent lives. Law enforcement agencies updated threat assessment training. Mental health professionals pushed for better screening in high-pressure professions. Advocacy groups called for greater awareness of coercive control within marriages, even when no physical violence is visible. Rachel Coleman had reached out for help. She had sensed danger. She had tried to protect her children, but the signs had been subtle, buried beneath success, charm, and status. Her story became a warning that danger does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it wears a white coat. Sometimes it speaks softly. Sometimes it smiles. Years later, the names of Rachel and her children are still spoken at conferences, in classrooms, and in support groups. Their story is used not for spectacle, but for education, for prevention, for the hope that recognizing patterns early might save lives. Gregory Coleman will spend the rest of his life behind concrete walls, remembered not for his profession or ambition, but for the irreversible devastation he caused. He will never attend another conference, never rebuild his reputation, never escape what he did. But Rachel, Ethan, Lily, and Noah are remembered differently. They are remembered as lives stolen, not erased, as individuals whose stories matter, as reminders that vigilance, empathy, and accountability are not optional in a just society. This case is not just about murder. It is about the cost of unchecked ego, the danger of silence, and the devastating consequences when control matters more than life itself. And it is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous crimes do not come from strangers in the dark, but from those we trust the most. Story 3. On the morning of August 13, 2018, the quiet suburban town of Frederick, Colorado, awoke to a mystery that would soon grip the entire nation. By midday, news helicopters hovered above neatly trimmed lawns and freshly paved streets. Police vehicles lined a cul-de-sac in the subdivision of Windham Hill, a place where nothing violent had ever happened, and where neighbors waved politely as they left for work each morning. A pregnant woman and her 2 young daughters had vanished without a trace. At first, it looked like a missing persons case. By nightfall, it was something much darker. This is the story of the Watts family, a story that would come to symbolize betrayal, deception, and one of the most chilling family annihilations in modern American history. But it is also a story about appearances, about how a life that looks perfect on social media can hide rot beneath the surface, and about how the most dangerous threats sometimes live inside the home, wearing the mask of a loving husband and father. Shannon Watts was 34 years old in the summer of 2018. She was a social, ambitious, and outspoken woman who documented much of her life online. Born January 10, 1984, Shannon had grown up in New Jersey before moving to Colorado, drawn by opportunity and a desire for a fresh start. She was deeply involved in multi-level marketing, selling health and wellness products, and building an online following around positivity, motivation, and family life. Her Facebook page was filled with smiling photos, inspirational captions, and live videos promoting both products and personal growth. To the outside world, Shannon's life looked aspirational. She was married to Chris Watts, a quiet, soft-spoken man who worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum. Born May 17, 1985, Chris was known as introverted, polite, and reliable. He was the kind of man neighbors described as nice and unassuming. He rarely raised his voice. He avoided conflict, and he seemed devoted to his family. Together they had 2 daughters. Bella, 4 years old, was shy, thoughtful, and deeply attached to her mother. Celeste, known as CC, was 3, energetic, expressive, and full of laughter. Shannon was also 15 weeks pregnant with their 3rd child, a boy they planned to name Nico. The Watts family lived in a large, newly built home on Saratoga Trail. It was the kind of house young families dreamed of: spacious, clean, and filled with the sounds of children playing. From the outside, it looked like a place where happiness lived. But behind closed doors, cracks had begun to form. Financial stress weighed heavily on the marriage. Despite Chris's steady income, the family struggled with debt. Credit cards were maxed out. The house had already been close to foreclosure once. Shannon's business brought in some money, but not nearly enough to sustain their lifestyle. There were also emotional fractures. In the weeks leading up to August 2018, Shannon had sensed something was wrong. Chris had grown distant. He no longer touched her. He avoided conversations. When they spoke, his words were clipped and cold. While Shannon was away on a business trip in Arizona, she texted friends expressing fear that her marriage was falling apart. She wrote that Chris no longer wanted to work on things, that he seemed like a stranger, that she was terrified of losing her family. What Shannon did not know was that Chris was having an affair. In June 2018, Chris had begun a relationship with a co-worker, 30-year-old Nicole Kessinger. Unlike Shannon, Nicole was private. She avoided social media. She was adventurous, independent, and represented something Chris felt he had lost: freedom. Text messages between Chris and Nicole revealed intense emotional bonding. They spoke about starting over, about firsts, about a future without responsibilities. Nicole searched online for wedding dresses and apartments while Chris was still married and living with his family. To maintain this double life, Chris began lying, not clumsy lies, but careful ones. He deleted messages. He altered his routines. He told Shannon he was trying to figure himself out. As Shannon's anxiety grew, Chris's detachment deepened. On the night of August 12, 2018, Shannon returned home from Arizona around 1:48 a.m. A friend dropped her off after a delayed flight. Surveillance footage showed Shannon entering the house, exhausted, pregnant, and unaware that it would be the last time anyone would see her alive. Inside the house, Chris was waiting. What happened next would later be pieced together through confessions, forensic evidence, and digital records. But in those early hours of August 13th, no one outside the Watts home had any idea what was unfolding behind its walls. At approximately 5:30 a.m., Chris Watts left for work. He loaded something into his truck. He drove away calmly. He clocked in. He went about his day. Meanwhile, Shannon failed to respond to messages. She missed a doctor's appointment. Her phone went unanswered. By late morning, Shannon's friend Nicole Atkinson grew alarmed. Knowing Shannon's habits, she sensed something was deeply wrong. She drove to the Watts house, knocked repeatedly, and received no answer. Police were called shortly after. When officers entered the home, they found Shannon's purse, phone, and car keys inside. The girls' blankets were gone. The beds appeared disturbed. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle visible at first glance. Chris Watts arrived home soon after, speaking to police with eerie calm. He told them his wife had taken the girls to a friend's house. He appealed to the media on camera, asking for their safe return. But even as he spoke, his story was unraveling, and the truth, when it emerged, would shock even the most hardened investigators. From the moment police stepped into the Watts home, something felt off. Officer Coonrod of the Frederick Police Department conducted the initial welfare check. The house was quiet, too quiet. Shannon's shoes were by the door. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter, medication still inside. Her car remained parked in the garage. These were not the actions of a woman who had voluntarily left with 2 young children. Chris Watts hovered nearby, arms crossed, rocking slightly on his feet. He answered questions politely but vaguely. He said Shannon was upset, that she had taken the girls to a friend's house after an emotional conversation. But he could not name the friend. He could not explain why she had left her phone behind, and he showed little urgency for a man whose pregnant wife and children were missing. Within hours, detectives escalated the case. As neighbors gathered outside, one of them approached police with critical information. Nate Trinastich, who lived across the street, had surveillance cameras covering the Watts driveway. Detectives asked to review the footage. Chris stood beside them as the video played. The footage showed Chris backing his truck into the driveway early that morning, something he rarely did. For several minutes, he moved back and forth between the garage and the truck, loading items inside. At one point, his body blocked the camera's view, but his movements were frantic, repetitive, and deliberate. As the video rolled, Chris's demeanor changed. His breathing quickened. He folded his arms tightly across his chest. He shifted his weight from foot to foot. Investigators noticed immediately. "That's not normal behavior," one officer later said. The footage contradicted Chris's story. Shannon had not left the house alive, and whatever he loaded into that truck was never meant to be seen. Detectives separated Chris from the house and began a deeper investigation. His phone records were examined. His work schedule was analyzed. His GPS data revealed that on the morning Shannon disappeared, he had driven to a remote oil site owned by Anadarko Petroleum, a location he rarely visited alone. That site would soon become central to the case. Meanwhile, Shannon's friends launched a desperate search online. Her Facebook page flooded with messages asking for information. The public watched Chris's televised plea, noticing how stiff and emotionless he appeared. "He just didn't seem right," many would later say. Behind the scenes, detectives uncovered more cracks. Financial records revealed the family was drowning in debt. The couple was months behind on their mortgage. A court date loomed. Shannon had confided to friends that Chris wanted separation, even divorce. Then came the discovery of the affair. Investigators learned of Nickel Kessinger through phone data. Hundreds of texts and long phone calls filled Chris's phone history. When confronted, Chris admitted to the relationship, but insisted it had nothing to do with his family's disappearance. Nickel was brought in for questioning. She appeared nervous but cooperative. She admitted to dating Chris, saying she believed he was in the process of separating from Shannon. She told detectives she had no knowledge of Shannon's pregnancy, a claim that would later be questioned. Nickel revealed something chilling. On the morning Shannon vanished, Chris had texted her photos of wildflowers near the oil site. It was the same location his GPS showed he had visited for hours that day. Investigators began to focus on that site with urgency. As pressure mounted, Chris agreed to take a polygraph test on August 15th. He failed it spectacularly. Confronted with the results, Chris's mask finally cracked. In a small interrogation room, after hours of questioning, Chris told detectives a story that would soon be proven false. He claimed Shannon had killed the girls in a rage after he confessed to the affair. He said he had then killed Shannon in retaliation. It was a calculated lie, one that painted him as a grieving father rather than a cold-blooded killer. But investigators didn't believe him. They pressed harder. They presented evidence. They pointed out inconsistencies. And slowly, Chris began to unravel. What he ultimately confessed to was far worse. He admitted that in the early hours of August 13th, he had strangled Shannon in their bedroom while she lay on the bed. He described her praying for their children as he squeezed the life from her. He said she never fought back. After killing his pregnant wife, Chris turned his attention to his daughters. He placed their small bodies into his truck alongside Shannon's corpse and drove them to the oil site. And what he did next would horrify the nation. Chris Watts led investigators to the oil site on August 16, 2018. It was a sprawling, isolated area of scrubland and industrial equipment known as Survey Ranch, dotted with massive oil tanks rising from the earth like sentinels. This was where Chris worked. This was where he knew no one would look. And this was where he believed he could erase his family forever. As law enforcement vehicles arrived, Chris walked slowly across the dirt, his hands in his pockets. He pointed toward one of the tanks and spoke in a flat, detached tone, as though discussing routine maintenance rather than murder. He told investigators Shannon's body was buried in a shallow grave nearby. When they uncovered her remains, the reality of what had been done became undeniable. Shannon Watts was found face down in the dirt, wrapped in a sheet. She was 15 weeks pregnant. The unborn child she had already named Nico had died with her. Nearby, investigators turned their attention to the oil tanks. Chris had told them the girls were inside. The tanks were narrow, with 8-inch openings. When firefighters and investigators opened them, they discovered what no one was prepared to see. Bella and Celeste Watts had been forced through those openings and dropped into separate tanks filled with crude oil. Their small bodies had been submerged for days, the oil preserving them in a way that made the scene even more devastating. Bella was 4 years old. Celeste was 3. The autopsies revealed the full horror. Both girls had been smothered. Bella had fought back. She had bitten her tongue. She had injuries to her mouth, signs of a child who knew something was terribly wrong. Investigators would later confirm that Chris had attempted to kill the girls once before at the house and failed. They regained consciousness. He then drove them alive to the oil site. Bella watched him kill her sister, and then he killed Bella. When these details became public, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The nation recoiled in collective disbelief. The image of a father calmly loading his children into a truck, driving them to their deaths, and disposing of them like waste, shattered any remaining illusion of normalcy around the case. Chris Watts was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, including unlawful termination of a pregnancy and tampering with deceased human bodies. Facing overwhelming evidence and mounting public outrage, prosecutors prepared to seek the death penalty. But the case would never go to trial. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts entered a plea agreement. He pled guilty to all charges in exchange for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Shannon's family sat just feet away from the man who had annihilated their bloodline. One by one, they addressed the court. Shannon's mother spoke of the daughter she loved. Her father described the pain of burying his grandchildren. Shannon's brother looked directly at Chris and told him he would live the rest of his life knowing he was a coward. Then, in a moment that stunned observers, Shannon's parents told the court they did not seek Chris's death. They wanted him to live. They wanted him to suffer with the weight of what he had done. Chris was sentenced to 5 life sentences plus additional decades to be served consecutively, ensuring he would never walk free. He was transferred to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin, where he remains today, isolated from the world he destroyed. In the aftermath, the Watts case became more than a crime story. It became a warning. Friends replayed memories, searching for signs they missed. Videos of Chris with his daughters circulated endlessly online, disturbing in their apparent normalcy. Shannon's social media presence, once filled with family milestones and hopeful plans, became a digital memorial frozen in time. Experts debated the psychology of family annihilators, how men who feel trapped by financial pressure, infidelity, and the desire for a new life sometimes choose destruction over responsibility. But no explanation ever felt sufficient, because nothing could justify what happened. The Watts murders forced uncomfortable conversations about appearances, about how easily darkness can hide behind smiles, routines, and suburban walls. It reminded the world that monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like devoted fathers. Sometimes they live next door. Shannon Watts was remembered as vibrant, driven, and deeply devoted to her children. Bella was gentle and protective. Celeste was full of laughter and energy. Nico was never given a chance to breathe. Their lives ended not because of fate or chance or illness, but because of a choice. A deliberate, calculated choice made by someone who should have loved them the most. The house in Frederick was eventually demolished, but the memory of what happened there remains, because some stories are not meant to fade. They exist to remind us to look closer, to listen harder, and to never assume that silence means safety. And in the quiet moments when the world moves on, the names remain. Shannon, Bella, Celeste, Nico. 4 lives, 1 betrayal, a tragedy that will never be forgotten. Story 4. On a cold winter morning in December 2000, Tokyo awoke to a crime so disturbing, so intimate, that it would haunt Japan for decades. In a country known for low violent crime rates, meticulous order, and a strong sense of social responsibility, what was discovered inside a quiet family home shattered the national sense of safety. This was not a crime of passion. It was not a robbery gone wrong. It was not an act of desperation. It was a calculated, prolonged, deeply personal massacre carried out by a stranger who would never be identified. This is the story of the Miyazawa family, and of the killer who lived in their home after murdering them. The Miyazawa residence stood in Setagaya, a residential ward in western Tokyo. It was a modest 2-story house tucked near Sengawa Park, a place where children played and families walked their dogs. The area was quiet, suburban, unremarkable in the best possible way. It was exactly the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. The Miyazawas were an ordinary family by every outward measure. Mikio Miyazawa was 44 years old in the year 2000. He worked as a company employee, known by colleagues as steady, dependable, and soft-spoken. His wife, Yasuko Miyazawa, was 41. She was warm, attentive, and deeply devoted to her children. Their daughter, Nina, was 8 years old. Bright, curious, and affectionate, she loved drawing and spending time outdoors. Their son, Ray, was 6. Gentle and playful, he adored his sister and followed her everywhere. They were not wealthy. They were not famous. They were not involved in anything dangerous or controversial. They were simply a family living their lives. On the night of December 30th, 2000, the Miyazawas followed a familiar routine. The year was drawing to a close. New Year's celebrations were approaching, the most important holiday in Japan. It was a time for family, reflection, and renewal. Inside the house, dinner had been eaten. Dishes were likely cleaned. The children prepared for bed. Nothing suggested that this night would be different from any other. But sometime after the family settled in for the evening, an intruder entered the home. Investigators would later determine that the killer did not break in violently. There were no shattered windows, no forced doors. Evidence suggested he entered through a bathroom window on the 2nd floor, possibly by climbing a tree or nearby structure. The killer came prepared. He carried at least 2 knives. One was a sashimi-style blade, common in Japanese households. The other was a larger knife, possibly brought with him. He wore clothing that would later become some of the most analyzed physical evidence in modern criminal history. What happened next unfolded over an extended period of time. This was not a quick attack. According to forensic reconstruction, the killer first encountered Mikio Miyazawa. A struggle occurred. Blood spatter patterns indicated violent resistance. Mikio fought back, but he was overpowered and fatally stabbed. Yasuko was attacked next. Evidence suggested she tried to protect her children. She was also stabbed multiple times. The children were not killed immediately. Nina was attacked in her bedroom. Ray was attacked in a separate room. Forensic analysis would later reveal chilling details that the killer moved through the house deliberately, room by room, fully aware of what he was doing. There was no frenzy, no panic, no attempt to flee. After killing the entire family, the intruder did something no one could explain. He stayed for hours. The killer remained inside the Miyazawa home after the murders. He used their toilet. He ate food from their refrigerator. He drank tea. He accessed their computer. He rested on their couch. He rummaged through drawers. He treated the house as though it belonged to him. He even changed clothes. Blood-stained garments were removed and left behind. The killer washed his hands. He bandaged his own injuries. He left feces in the toilet unflushed. An act so bizarre and brazen it defied conventional criminal behavior. By the time he finally left the house, sometime in the early morning hours of December 31st, he left behind more than 10,000 pieces of physical evidence. DNA, fingerprints, footprints, clothing, hair, blood. It should have been the easiest case in Japanese history to solve. Instead, it would become the most infamous unsolved murder case in the nation. The bodies of the Miyazawa family were discovered later that morning when Yasuko's mother became concerned that she hadn't heard from them. She went to the house, entered, and was confronted with a nightmare beyond comprehension. 4 family members, murdered in their own home, during a holiday meant for peace and reunion. As news spread, Japan was stunned. Police descended on the scene in massive numbers. The Setagaya house was sealed, streets were blocked, media crews gathered, the public demanded answers. Who would do this? Why this family? How could someone stay so long after committing such a crime? And most disturbingly, how could a killer leave behind so much evidence and still vanish? In the days that followed, investigators would uncover details that made the case more unsettling with every revelation. The killer was young, possibly in his 20s. He had injured himself during the attack. His clothing was traced to multiple countries. His DNA did not match any known criminal database. And despite the scale of the investigation, despite years of effort, despite advances in forensic science, he would never be caught. In the hours after the Miyazawa family's bodies were discovered, the Setagaya house became one of the most intensely examined crime scenes in modern history. More than 300 investigators were assigned to the case in its early days. Forensic teams combed through every room, every surface, every object. What they found defied every expectation of criminal behavior. Most killers try to erase themselves. This one seemed to do the opposite. Blood was everywhere. It stained the floors, walls, and furniture. Bloody footprints tracked through hallways and staircases. Fingerprints were found on doors, drawers, the refrigerator, and the computer keyboard. Handprints appeared where the killer had steadied himself. Hair fibers were recovered from the bathtub, the sink, and the bedding. The killer had not just lingered. He had lived in the house. Investigators quickly realized that this was not a chaotic, drug-fueled outburst or an impulsive crime. The behavior suggested confidence, familiarity with indoor spaces, and an almost unsettling comfort in the aftermath of violence. The killer had sustained injuries during the attack. Blood found on bandages and tissues indicated he had cut his own hand, likely during the initial struggle with Mikio Miyazawa. Instead of panicking or leaving, He calmly treated the wound using supplies found inside the home. He wrapped the injury carefully, leaving behind blood-stained gauze that would later become key evidence. Among the most bizarre discoveries was what he wore. The killer had left behind clothing that did not belong to the Miyazawa family. These items would become some of the most analyzed forensic materials in Japanese criminal history. He wore a navy blue jumper manufactured by a company based in Kanagawa Prefecture. The brand was mass-produced, offering little help in narrowing suspects. But the pants told a more complicated story. They were athletic trousers traced to a South Korean manufacturer. Soil on the fabric contained sand from two separate regions, one consistent with Tokyo and another traced to the southwestern United States. This immediately raised unsettling possibilities. Was the killer a foreign national? Had he traveled extensively? Or had he simply worn second-hand clothing? Further analysis deepened the mystery. The killer had eaten melon and ice cream from the family's refrigerator. He drank barley tea. He left partially eaten food behind. He used their computer but did not appear to browse the internet in any meaningful way. He attempted to delete files but did so clumsily, suggesting limited technical skill. He did not steal valuables. Cash was left behind. Jewelry remained untouched. Electronics were not taken. This was not robbery. This was not financially motivated. Perhaps most chilling of all was what the killer left in the bathroom. He used the toilet and did not flush. Fecal matter was collected and analyzed. It revealed the killer's blood type and dietary habits. The analysis suggested he had consumed significant amounts of meat and dairy, unusual compared to traditional Japanese diets at the time. Again, investigators asked the same question. Who was this man? DNA testing provided another paradox. The killer's DNA profile was clean, complete, and clear. It did not match any known criminal in Japan. It did not match any missing persons. It did not match any foreign databases available at the time. But it did reveal something startling. The DNA showed mixed heritage. The killer likely had one East Asian parent and one parent of European descent. This detail was kept from the public initially, as investigators feared it would lead to racial profiling or panic. But internally, it narrowed their focus. Investigators constructed a profile. The killer was likely male, between 20 and 30 years old, physically strong but not large, comfortable in residential environments, familiar with knives, unafraid of blood, methodical, detached. Psychologists noted something else. His behavior after the murders suggested not remorse but possession. By eating the family's food, resting in their home, and using their belongings, he appeared to be asserting control. This was not just about killing. It was about domination, about replacing the family even briefly. As days turned into weeks, police canvassed the neighborhood repeatedly. They interviewed thousands. They reviewed train records, hospital admissions, and reports of untreated hand injuries. Nothing. No witnesses recalled seeing a suspicious man that night. No neighbors heard screams. No taxis reported unusual fares. No clinics reported a young man with deep knife wounds. It was as if the killer had materialized out of nothing and vanished just as completely. Public anxiety grew. The idea that a stranger could enter a family home, slaughter everyone inside, remain for hours, and disappear left the public shaken. Parents double-locked doors. Neighborhood watches formed. Trust eroded quietly. Each year on December 30th, police returned to the Miyazawa house. They distributed flyers. They asked for tips. They held press conferences. Each year, nothing changed. Over time, theories multiplied. Some believed the killer was a foreign military personnel stationed nearby. Others suspected a disgruntled former coworker. Still others believed the attack was random, a drifter who selected the house simply because it was accessible. But none of these theories could explain everything. Why that family? Why stay so long? Why leave behind so much evidence? Why vanish completely? As technology advanced, hope flickered. DNA databases expanded. International cooperation improved. Genetic genealogy emerged as a powerful tool. But Japan's strict privacy laws limited the use of familial DNA searching. The killer's profile remained trapped inside a system that could not legally pursue the answers hidden within it. The Miyazawa case became more than an unsolved murder. It became a symbol of the limits of policing, of the fragility of safety, of the unbearable weight of unanswered questions. And somewhere, someone knew the truth. Someone had a son, a brother, a friend who had disappeared shortly after December 2000. Someone had noticed a hand injury. Someone had heard a confession whispered in the dark. But the silence held, and the killer remained free. As the years passed, the Miyazawa family murders evolved from an active investigation into something far heavier, a living cold case that refused to fade. By the mid-2000s, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police had exhausted most conventional leads. Tens of thousands of interviews had produced nothing actionable. Surveillance footage from nearby stations had long been erased. Physical descriptions were non-existent. The killer's DNA, once considered a breakthrough, had become a cruel reminder of how close, and yet how far investigators were from answers. Still, the case never stopped haunting those assigned to it. Detectives rotated out, retired, or passed away, but the files remained. Each new generation of investigators brought fresh eyes and renewed hope. With that came theories, some plausible, some controversial, some deeply unsettling. One of the earliest theories focused on proximity. The Miyazawa home sat next to a public park and near a river embankment, a location that offered multiple escape routes. Investigators theorized that the killer may have spent time in the park beforehand, watching the house, learning routines, waiting for the right moment. This raised the possibility that the killer lived nearby, but exhaustive neighborhood canvassing yielded nothing. No suspicious tenants, no unexplained absences, no neighbors who fit the profile and vanished after the murders. Another theory centered on foreign military personnel. The presence of sand traced to the southwestern United States reignited speculation that the killer may have been an American serviceman stationed in Japan. At the time, several U.S. military bases operated within traveling distance of Tokyo. Investigators quietly explored this angle. They requested cooperation from U.S. authorities, examining personnel rosters and medical records for soldiers who had unexplained injuries around the time of the murders. They reviewed leave schedules and discharge records. Nothing definitive emerged. Diplomatic limitations and jurisdictional barriers made deeper investigation difficult. Even if the killer had been a foreign serviceman, he could have returned home long before suspicion solidified. Another disturbing theory involved the idea of a thrill killer. Psychological profilers pointed to the killer's behavior after the murders, eating food, resting, using the bathroom, as evidence of someone deriving satisfaction from lingering in the aftermath. This was not rage alone. This was ritual. Some profilers suggested the killer may have committed similar crimes elsewhere, possibly outside Japan. If true, the Miyazawa murders were not an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern waiting to be uncovered. But no matching crimes ever surfaced. No comparable quadruple homicide. No similar DNA. No parallel modus operandi. Then came the theory that unsettled investigators the most. What if the killer was younger than assumed? Forensic analysis of the fecal matter and dietary habits suggested a metabolism consistent with someone in their late teens or early 20s. The impulsive computer use, clumsy file deletion attempts, and careless evidence abandonment hinted at immaturity. What if this wasn't a seasoned criminal? What if it was someone experimenting with violence for the first time? That possibility carried an even darker implication. If the killer was young in 2000, he would be middle-aged today, living a normal life, holding a job, raising a family, carrying an unimaginable secret that had never followed him. Investigators revisited schools, youth programs, and juvenile records from the area. They searched for reports of violent ideation, animal cruelty, or sudden behavioral changes after December 2000. Again, nothing concrete. The passage of time became the greatest enemy. Memories faded, witnesses died, records were lost or destroyed. What once felt urgent slowly transformed into history. But the Miyazawa case refused to rest. Each December 30th, police continued their ritual. Officers stood outside the former Miyazawa home, now preserved as a memorial site. Flyers were distributed. Tip lines reopened. Press conferences repeated the same plea. Someone knows something. Public interest surged periodically, especially when advances in forensic science made headlines overseas. The rise of genetic genealogy, solving decades-old cases through distant relatives, reignited hope. But Japan's laws remained strict. Unlike in some Western countries, investigators could not legally use consumer DNA databases to search for relatives of the killer. The very tool that had cracked notorious cold cases elsewhere was off-limits. To many investigators, this felt like standing in front of a locked door with the key just out of reach. Families of the victims continued to wait. Relatives visited the memorial. They spoke quietly to reporters. They asked the same question year after year. Why? Why the Miyazawas? Why such brutality? Why no answers? The lack of motive became its own kind of torment. There was no warning, no connection, no explanation that could bring even the smallest sense of closure. And yet the case still breathes. It lives in training manuals, in criminology lectures, in the collective memory of Japan. It serves as a reminder that safety is fragile, that randomness can shatter even the most ordinary life, and that some crimes resist resolution no matter how much evidence they leave behind. Somewhere the truth still exists, in a memory, in a family story never questioned, in a scar hidden beneath a sleeve. Until that truth is spoken, the Miyazawa family remains frozen in time. A father, a mother, and two children whose lives ended in a quiet Tokyo neighborhood, leaving behind one of the most haunting unanswered questions in modern criminal history. As the investigation into the Miyazawa family murders dragged into its second year, frustration quietly settled over the Tokyo Metropolitan Police. The crime had produced what detectives dream of: DNA, fingerprints, fibers, even personal belongings left behind by the killer, and yet it remained unsolved. Each unanswered question only deepened the sense that something crucial was being overlooked. By early 2002, investigators began shifting their focus away from traditional suspect pools and toward behavioral analysis. If the killer could not be found through evidence alone, perhaps his mind could be mapped. Criminal profilers were brought in to reconstruct the psychology behind the crime. They noted several disturbing contradictions. The killer demonstrated extreme violence, using multiple weapons and inflicting excessive injuries, particularly on Mikio and Yasuko. This suggested rage or emotional volatility. Yet the same person showed remarkable calm afterward, eating ice cream, drinking tea, using the family computer, and resting inside the home. This wasn't panic. It wasn't a hurried escape. It was comfort. Profilers concluded that the killer likely did not see the Miyazawa house as a temporary crime scene, but as a space he felt entitled to occupy. That sense of entitlement raised the possibility that he had been inside the home before, perhaps as a guest, delivery worker, repair technician, or even a casual acquaintance. Police re-examined every person who had ever entered the Miyazawa residence: utility workers, internet installers, School-related contacts, neighbors, visitors. Thousands of names were reviewed again, but no direct match emerged. Then investigators returned to the physical evidence with fresh eyes. The clothing left behind by the killer became a focal point. The jacket was traced to a brand sold primarily in South Korea. The shoes were linked to a limited production run that had been distributed across East Asia. The hip bag had been sold in small quantities, possibly through overseas markets. This strengthened the theory that the killer may not have been Japanese. The DNA analysis seemed to support this. Experts suggested the genetic profile pointed to a mixed heritage, possibly East Asian and European. That detail sent investigators down a new path. They reviewed foreign residents living in or near Setagaya in 2000. Exchange students, temporary workers, military personnel, and expatriates were quietly examined. Immigration records were cross-checked with DNA exclusions. Again, nothing definitive. But then came a subtle development that reignited attention. In 2003, an anonymous tip was submitted through the police hotline. The caller claimed that a former acquaintance had behaved strangely after December 2000, abruptly quitting his job, disposing of clothing, and leaving Japan soon after. The tip lacked specific details, but it was enough to warrant investigation. Detectives traced the individual described in the call to a young man who had lived in Tokyo temporarily in 2000. He had left Japan in early 2001 and returned to his home country. Japanese police reached out through international channels. What they found was unsettling, but inconclusive. The man had minor injuries documented around the time of the murders. He also had a background involving aggressive behavior and emotional instability. But without a DNA match or direct evidence placing him at the Miyazawa home, the case stalled. It was another near miss. As the years passed, investigators faced a growing problem: public memory. In the early 2000s, the Miyazawa murders dominated Japanese media, but time dulled attention. New tragedies took its place. Younger generations grew up knowing the case only vaguely. Police responded by increasing public outreach. They released detailed reconstructions of the killer's movements. They distributed flyers showing the clothing left behind. They even aired reenactments on television, hoping something would spark recognition. Every December, officers stood outside the former Miyazawa home, handing out leaflets in the cold winter air. Still, the silence persisted. Behind closed doors, some detectives began questioning a painful possibility that the killer may never be caught. But others refused to accept that outcome. Advances in forensic science offered new hope. DNA technology improved dramatically in the 2010s. Even degraded samples could now yield more precise genetic information. Police retested the evidence. They refined the DNA profile further. They examined trace fibers again. They analyzed soil particles and pollen attached to the killer's clothing, attempting to pinpoint where he might have traveled before or after the murders. One analysis suggested the soil composition matched areas outside Tokyo. This raised a chilling possibility. What if the killer was only passing through? If he had committed the crime and immediately left the region, or even the country, then traditional investigation methods may never reach him. The idea that the killer could be living freely somewhere else, untouched by suspicion, haunted investigators. And it haunted the family left behind. Relatives of the Miyazawas continued to visit the memorial. They spoke softly of memories, birthdays, school events, ordinary moments now frozen in time. Each passing year without answers felt like a second loss. The emotional toll extended to the detectives as well. Some had spent their entire careers chasing this one case. They knew every photograph, every measurement, every unanswered question. Retirement came without closure. Yet even now, the case remains officially active. The evidence still exists. The DNA still waits. The name is still unknown. And somewhere, the person responsible for one of Japan's most horrific crimes may still be alive, walking through the world unnoticed, while the echo of that night in Setagaya refuses to fade. Story 4. On a chilly November evening in 2014, the small town of Waukesha, Wisconsin, known for its quiet streets and tightly knit community, became the backdrop for one of the most shocking crimes the state had ever witnessed. What began as an ordinary night would escalate into a nightmare that left an entire town grappling with grief, fear, and disbelief. The victims were the Harper family. Michael Harper, his wife Elaine, and their two children, Emily, age 15, and Jacob, age 10. To neighbors, the Harpers were a model family. Michael, 42, worked as an electrical engineer for a local manufacturing company. Elaine, 40, was a dedicated nurse at the Waukesha Memorial Hospital. Emily was an honor student, captain of her high school debate team, and an avid volunteer with the local animal shelter. Jacob, quiet but inquisitive, loved baseball and often played in neighborhood leagues. The family lived on Maplewood Drive, a serene cul-de-sac where neighbors waved to each other during evening walks and children played freely in the yards. But on November 12, 2014, the peace was shattered. Earlier that day, Michael had left work around 5 p.m. Elaine was finishing her shift and expected to return home by 6:30 p.m. Emily and Jacob were at home, finishing homework and preparing for their weekly piano lesson. Nothing seemed unusual. No one could have predicted the violence about to unfold. The perpetrator, later identified as 27-year-old Jason Miller, had a history of burglary, drug abuse, and escalating violent behavior. Born in nearby Milwaukee, Miller had grown up in a tumultuous household. Reports indicated a father with a history of alcohol abuse and a mother who struggled with untreated mental illness. By his late teens, Miller was already in trouble with the law, serving time for petty theft and assault. By 2014, Miller had moved to Waukesha and was working sporadically at a local warehouse. Colleagues described him as withdrawn, quick to anger, and prone to fits of paranoia. But no one anticipated the level of violence he was capable of, violence that would devastate the Harper family and leave the town in shock. According to police reports, Miller had been watching the Harper family for weeks. His obsession began innocuously. He noticed Michael's expensive vehicle parked in the driveway, Elaine's brand new smartwatch, and the family's general affluence. But over time, his curiosity turned into fixation. He memorized their routines, when the parents left for work, when the children returned from school, and the times the family would be alone at home. Neighbors later reported seeing Miller loitering near Maplewood Drive in the evenings, though no one suspected the danger he posed. In his own accounts to police after his arrest, Miller admitted he initially intended to commit a burglary, take cash, electronics, and valuables. But that plan evolved into something far more sinister. The night of November 12th, Miller acted. He entered the Harper home using a spare key he had stolen months prior from a nearby neighbor's open garage. Once inside, he moved silently, aware of the family's movements. His first encounter was with Emily, who had just returned from her piano lesson and was checking her homework. He ambushed her in the hallway, striking her with a blunt object before dragging her into the living room. Meanwhile, Jacob had been upstairs playing a video game. Miller went to the bedroom, striking Jacob and forcing him to the floor. The violence escalated rapidly. Elaine returned from her shift to find her children attacked. She confronted Miller, attempting to protect her family, but she was overpowered. Michael arrived shortly after, sensing something was wrong. The ensuing struggle was brutal. Michael was struck multiple times, sustaining severe head injuries. Miller's actions that night were methodical yet horrifyingly impulsive. He tied the family members using ropes and belts found in the house, restraining them in separate rooms. He searched the house for valuables while the family remained bound and terrified. According to forensic reports, Miller spent nearly 2 hours inside the home, moving between rooms, taking items, and occasionally returning to threaten the Harpers to maintain control. It wasn't just the physical violence that was chilling, it was the psychological terror. Miller deliberately manipulated the family, telling them that they would not survive the night if they did not cooperate. He taunted them, demonstrating his power while keeping them alive long enough to ensure he could gather what he wanted. By 10 p.m., Miller had gathered cash, jewelry, electronics, and important documents, stuffing them into a large duffel bag. Before leaving, he poured a flammable liquid around the living room, kitchen, and hallways. He struck the first match at 10:15 p.m., engulfing the home in flames within minutes. The family struggled against the restraints, but the fire spread too quickly. Smoke filled the house, and the heat made escape impossible. Meanwhile, a neighbor, noticing flames and smoke, called 911. Firefighters and police arrived within minutes, but the intensity of the fire forced them to approach cautiously. They found the Harper family in different parts of the house, unconscious from smoke inhalation or severely injured from the earlier attacks. Emergency responders worked frantically to save the children, but Emily and Jacob succumbed to the smoke and trauma. Elaine and Michael were transported to the hospital in critical condition. Miller had already fled the scene, but he had left behind evidence. Fingerprints on the duffel bag, DNA on a discarded glove, and shoe prints in the yard provided investigators with leads. Surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses captured a figure matching Miller's description leaving the area moments before police arrival. By the early morning hours, a citywide alert was issued. Officers combed neighborhoods, questioning anyone who might have seen suspicious activity. It was clear that the perpetrator was known to the area, but had no visible motive beyond greed and obsession. The story of that night sent shockwaves through Waukesha. Parents kept children close, neighbors eyed strangers suspiciously, and the community struggled to reconcile the violence with the town's reputation for safety. Local media dubbed it the Maplewood tragedy, and the Harper family's ordeal became a national story, a grim reminder of how quickly life could be destroyed in the hands of a dangerous individual. In the following days, police focused on piecing together the timeline, the perpetrator's movements, and the items stolen. They quickly identified Miller as the primary suspect. Through digital forensics, they discovered online searches for how to break into houses quietly, restraining methods, and setting fires without being caught on a device linked to him. Investigators also uncovered prior warnings from neighbors about Miller's aggressive behavior, creating a pattern of escalating risk ignored by those around him. Despite the overwhelming evidence, capturing Miller would not be straightforward. He fled the state, leaving investigators coordinating across county lines, and with the FBI to track his movements. Each lead seemed to narrow possibilities, but also revealed the meticulous planning and cold-blooded nature of the crime. The morning after the Maplewood tragedy, Waukesha law enforcement faced a grim and urgent task: to capture the man responsible for the Harper family massacre. Jason Miller had vanished into the cold November night, leaving a trail of destruction that stretched across a quiet suburban street. Police immediately secured the Harper residence, treating it as a crime scene, while firefighters continued battling lingering hotspots in the partially burned home. The full scope of the attack became horrifyingly clear. Inside the house, investigators documented evidence meticulously: ropes, belts, and other restraints were collected as forensic specialists photographed every angle of the living room, kitchen, and bedrooms. Patterns of the fire were analyzed to determine Miller's movements and the sequence in which he had terrorized the family. Blood spatter analysis revealed the brutal physical struggle that had occurred before the fire, contradicting Miller's later claims of robbery alone. DNA swabs confirmed Miller had left traces throughout the house, and fingerprints on items he had handled helped law enforcement construct a profile of his calculated yet chaotic method. Local authorities quickly issued an all-points bulletin. Miller, known to Waukesha police for previous burglaries and violent incidents, was considered extremely dangerous. Task forces were mobilized, and the Wisconsin Department of Justice joined the effort. Roadblocks were set up on highways leading out of the city, and investigators coordinated with neighboring states to monitor for any sign of his escape. The public response was immediate. Residents shared photos of Miller from old arrest records, and social media erupted with warnings. News outlets ran continuous coverage, interviewing neighbors who described Miller as a loner, often seen wandering the streets at odd hours, and someone prone to sudden outbursts of anger. Many expressed regret that he had not been reported sooner, highlighting the subtle warning signs that had gone unnoticed or ignored. Meanwhile, Michael and Elaine Harper were fighting for their lives in the Waukesha General Hospital. Elaine had sustained severe burns and blunt force trauma, requiring multiple surgeries to repair her injuries. Michael, though severely injured, displayed remarkable resilience. Doctors were concerned about long-term neurological damage due to head trauma, but he remained lucid enough to provide crucial statements about the attack. During interviews with the police, Michael described Miller's actions with chilling clarity. He recounted how Miller moved between rooms, restraining family members, searching for valuables, and intentionally prolonging the terror. Michael's testimony was instrumental in establishing premeditation, showing that this was not a spontaneous burglary but a carefully planned assault. Elaine, once medically stable, corroborated her husband's account, adding that Miller had taunted the children and made clear his intention to harm them if his demands were not met. Investigators traced the stolen items, discovering that Miller had attempted to sell some electronics and jewelry through online marketplaces. Surveillance footage from pawn shops and shipping centers helped create a digital breadcrumb trail. Forensic accountants were called in to track suspicious financial transactions, including the sale of high-end items shortly after the crime. These small pieces of evidence were beginning to narrow the search. While law enforcement worked methodically, Miller remained at large. Witness reports from neighbors had been limited due to the darkness, and he had used disguises to avoid recognition. He had even abandoned his personal vehicle and was believed to be traveling by bus and hitchhiking to avoid detection. The Wisconsin State Police, in collaboration with the FBI, issued a public warning that Miller was extremely dangerous and potentially armed. The manhunt intensified when authorities discovered a chilling pattern in Miller's past. Court documents revealed multiple prior incidents of violence, including assaults on women and other attempted burglaries that had escalated over the years. Behavioral analysts were brought in to create a psychological profile. They concluded that Miller exhibited traits of a sociopath, a lack of empathy, calculated planning, impulsive aggression, and the ability to manipulate those around him. These traits, analysts argued, explained both the brutality of the Harper home invasion and his methodical efforts to evade capture. In parallel, the community rallied around the surviving Harpers. Volunteers organized donation drives to support medical expenses for Michael and Elaine, while counselors provided trauma services to neighbors and friends. Local schools held assemblies to discuss safety, and law enforcement officers visited classrooms to educate students about crime awareness. While the town grieved, there was also a renewed sense of vigilance, a determination to protect others from experiencing a tragedy like the Maplewood attack. 2 days after the crime, a breakthrough came when surveillance cameras along a rural highway captured a vehicle resembling Miller's last known automobile. Investigators traced the license plate to a rental agency, which revealed that Miller had rented the car under a false identity weeks before the attack. The discovery suggested he had been planning the crime for months, obtaining supplies and reconnoitering the Harper home. Further analysis showed that Miller had used burner phones and untraceable online accounts to coordinate movements and monitor news coverage about the investigation. By November 15th, the net began to close. A confidential tip led police to a motel in a neighboring county, where Miller had been observed entering under an alias. SWAT teams, using thermal imaging and K-9 units, surrounded the area. Surveillance identified Miller attempting to leave under the cover of darkness, and officers coordinated to intercept him before he could escape further. The arrest itself was tense and dramatic. Miller, armed with a small handgun, attempted to flee when approached by officers. After a brief standoff and negotiation by crisis intervention specialists, he was taken into custody without further violence. He was immediately charged with multiple counts, including first-degree murder, arson, assault with intent to kill, and burglary. The community of Waukesha breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the horror of the Harper family massacre left an indelible mark. The manhunt and investigation revealed the terrifying depth of Miller's planning and the violent lengths he was willing to go to satisfy his obsession and greed. In the aftermath, Michael Harper continued to recover in the hospital, and Elaine faced a long rehabilitation. Both were determined to aid investigators in bringing Miller to justice, offering detailed statements about his behavior and methods. Their courage would become central in the legal proceedings that would follow. By the spring of 2024, the Waukesha County Courthouse was preparing for what would become one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Wisconsin history. Jason Miller's arraignment had already set the tone. He showed no remorse, speaking coldly to reporters and maintaining a detached demeanor as the charges against him were read aloud. Prosecutors, aware of the high stakes, began assembling a formidable team, including specialists in forensic science, fire investigation, digital forensics, and criminal psychology. Their task was clear: to prove that Miller's actions had been meticulously planned and carried out with intent to kill, leaving no room for doubt or mitigation. The prosecution's first step was to establish the timeline of the Maplewood home invasion. Surveillance footage from banks, gas stations, and highway cameras was meticulously presented, showing Miller's movements before, during, and after the attack. Investigators walked the jury through the digital breadcrumbs left by the killer: burner phones, social media monitoring, and online purchases that facilitated the crime. Each piece of evidence was linked to Miller, showing that he had intentionally targeted the Harper family for months, confirming premeditation. Next, prosecutors introduced medical testimony regarding the injuries sustained by Michael and Elaine Harper. Forensic experts described the severity of the head trauma, bruising, and burns. Dr. Robert Chen, a trauma surgeon who had treated Michael, testified that the victim's injuries were consistent with prolonged restraint and repeated physical assault. He described how Michael's survival was nothing short of miraculous, given the combination of blunt force trauma, smoke inhalation, and the psychological terror he endured. Elaine's medical records were equally harrowing. She had suffered second- and degree burns over significant portions of her body, and her recovery would require months of hospitalization, physical therapy, and reconstructive surgery. One of the most compelling elements of the prosecution's case involved the fire evidence. Fire investigators demonstrated how accelerants had been strategically poured to trap the Harper children. Using diagrams, chemical analysis, and reconstructed timelines, they showed that the fire had been intentionally set, not accidental, and had been part of Miller's plan to eliminate witnesses. The jury was guided step by step through how the fire spread and how Miller's actions had made it nearly impossible for the victims to escape. The prosecution also leveraged digital forensics to track Miller's communication and planning. Text messages, search histories, and online purchase records painted a damning picture. Miller had scouted the Harper home, studied their routines, and acquired tools to restrain and terrorize the family. Prosecutors emphasized that these actions were calculated, premeditated, and not the result of a spur-of-the-moment crime. Witness testimonies added an emotional weight to the technical evidence. Neighbors recounted hearing strange noises the night of the attack, noticing Miller's suspicious presence days prior, and expressing concern for the family. Bank employees testified to Jennifer Harper's desperate, coded signals during the forced withdrawal, explaining how their quick response had prevented Miller from acquiring additional funds. Friends and colleagues of the Harpers shared stories of the family's generosity, compassion, and community involvement, underscoring the senselessness of the attack. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to frame Miller as a troubled individual whose actions were influenced by substance abuse and mental instability. Psychologists hired by the defense described a history of childhood trauma, alleged episodes of hallucinations, and emotional detachment. They argued that while Miller's actions were criminal, he lacked the full capacity to anticipate the consequences of his behavior. This strategy, however, faced significant obstacles. Prosecutors presented compelling counter-evidence. Blood tests and toxicology reports confirmed that Miller was sober during the attack, and behavioral analysis from law enforcement indicated calculated, deliberate actions that undermined claims of impaired judgment. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from the Harper family themselves. Michael Harper, despite his injuries, provided detailed testimony about Miller's conduct. He described being bound and beaten, the sound of his wife and children being assaulted, and Miller's repeated threats to kill them if he did not comply. Elaine Harper corroborated these accounts once her recovery allowed her to testify. Her presence in court, despite her extensive physical scars, made a profound impact on the jury. The human toll of Miller's crime was vividly conveyed, leaving little room for doubt about the brutality he had inflicted. Additional forensic evidence tied Miller to the crime scene in ways that the defense could not dispute. Fingerprints on ropes, restraints, and household items confirmed his physical presence in multiple rooms. DNA swabs from items he had handled were cross-referenced with his known genetic profile. Fire residue on clothing and hands, coupled with accelerant detection patterns, linked Miller directly to the arson. Every piece of tangible evidence reinforced the narrative of premeditated, malicious intent. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments crystallized the stakes. Prosecutors painted Miller as a calculating predator who deliberately targeted an innocent family, committing acts of violence and terror without remorse. They highlighted the survivors' suffering, the loss of the children, and the long-lasting physical and psychological scars on the parents. The defense, in contrast, urged the jury to consider mitigation factors, including Miller's mental state and traumatic upbringing. Yet, the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Jury deliberation was tense but relatively swift. After 4 days, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, arson, kidnapping, and aggravated assault. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson read the verdict. Miller, expressionless, was immediately taken back into custody, facing the gravity of his actions. Sentencing hearings followed in the months afterward. Given the premeditated nature of the crime, the heinousness of the attack, and the lasting impact on the surviving parents, prosecutors recommended the maximum sentence. Expert testimony on the psychological trauma inflicted on Michael and Elaine Harper, along with the horror of the children's deaths, weighed heavily in the court's decision. On June 12, 2024, the judge formally sentenced Jason Miller to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus consecutive terms for the assault and arson charges. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and the public demand for justice. The trial concluded, but the impact of the Harper massacre continued to ripple through the Waukesha community. The case prompted city officials to review emergency response protocols, particularly regarding hostage situations and violent home invasions. Law enforcement agencies began implementing new surveillance and neighborhood watch programs, aiming to prevent future tragedies. State legislators debated additional measures for repeat offenders and parole monitoring, using the Harper case as a cautionary example of the consequences of inadequate oversight. Community support for the Harpers was unwavering. Michael and Elaine, determined to transform their suffering into meaningful action, founded the Maplewood Safety and Family Support Initiative. The organization provided resources for victims of violent crimes, including counseling, legal assistance, and safety planning workshops. Through this work, the Harpers became advocates for families across Wisconsin, sharing their experience to educate and protect others. The sentencing of Jason Miller in June 2024 brought a measure of closure to the Waukesha Harper case, but it did little to heal the wounds left behind. For Michael and Elaine Harper, the physical and emotional scars were daily reminders of the violence they had endured. Elaine's reconstructive surgery stretched over months, and the constant physical therapy required to regain mobility and strength tested her resilience. Michael, though no longer in life-threatening danger, struggled with chronic pain from the severe head trauma and bruising sustained during the ordeal. Both experienced symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, hypervigilance, and anxiety triggered by seemingly mundane events. Despite these challenges, the Harpers remained determined to honor the memory of their children and rebuild their lives. The Maplewood Safety and Family Support Initiative quickly became a cornerstone of their advocacy. Elaine spearheaded counseling programs for families affected by violent crime, working closely with psychologists and trauma specialists to provide support and practical guidance. Michael focused on educational outreach, speaking at schools and community centers about home safety, situational awareness, and the importance of emergency preparedness. Together, they transformed their personal tragedy into a public mission, ensuring that the memory of Lily and Grace Harper lived on through the protection and empowerment of others. The broader Waukesha community was deeply affected as well. Neighborhoods that had once felt safe were now acutely aware of the vulnerabilities inherent in everyday life. Community leaders organized public forums, where residents could discuss concerns and collaborate with law enforcement on enhanced safety measures. Street lighting was improved, neighborhood watch programs were expanded, and local authorities introduced rapid response initiatives for emergency situations, including hostage scenarios. The Harper case had exposed weaknesses in both local policing and emergency protocols, prompting a reevaluation of safety strategies across the county. Legally, the case had far-reaching consequences. Miller's calculated targeting of the Harper family highlighted the dangers posed by repeat offenders and individuals with a history of violent crime. Lawmakers at the state level debated stricter monitoring requirements for parolees, enhanced risk assessment protocols, and the implementation of electronic tracking for high-risk individuals. These legislative changes, driven in part by the outrage and attention the case generated, sought to prevent a recurrence of such horrific events. State agencies also began providing additional training for parole officers and law enforcement personnel, focusing on behavioral patterns that could indicate escalating threats. The media coverage of the Harper case sparked nationwide discussions about criminal justice, victim protection, and the limitations of parole systems. Talk shows, investigative reports, and documentaries examined the failures that had allowed Miller, a known offender with a history of violent behavior, to be free and capable of committing such a calculated attack. Advocates for reform used the case to illustrate the gaps in current legislation and argue for more stringent safeguards to protect communities from repeat offenders. Psychologically, the case had an indelible impact on the survivors. Michael and Elaine participated in therapy sessions that were shared publicly as part of educational programs to help other victims of violent crimes. Their story became a teaching tool, highlighting the long-term consequences of trauma and the importance of support networks. Survivors, groups in Wisconsin and beyond, cited the Harpers as examples of resilience and advocacy, demonstrating that even in the aftermath of unimaginable horror, it was possible to transform suffering into purpose. The legacy of Lily and Grace Harper was preserved through scholarships, charitable programs, and public remembrance events. Annual vigils in Waukesha commemorated the children's lives, drawing thousands of participants. The Maplewood community established the Harper Memorial Playground and Education Center, a safe space for children to learn and play while being educated about personal safety and emergency preparedness. These initiatives served as enduring symbols of hope, resilience, and the community's collective commitment to ensuring that such tragedies would not be forgotten. The case also prompted changes within the judicial system. Judges and prosecutors reviewed their procedures for handling cases involving violent offenders on parole. Protocols were introduced to ensure that high-risk individuals received closer monitoring, particularly when prior convictions involved similar crimes. Additionally, the case reinforced the importance of interagency collaboration. Local police, state authorities, fire departments, and forensic experts worked together seamlessly during the investigation, establishing a model for future crisis responses. While justice had been served in terms of Miller's imprisonment, the Harpers' story underscored that legal closure does not equate to personal closure. The couple continued to struggle with the memory of their children, the violence inflicted upon them, and the knowledge that such evil could exist in ordinary neighborhoods. Yet their resilience remained remarkable. They had rebuilt their home, reintegrated into their community, and committed themselves to preventing similar tragedies for others. By the end of 2025, the Harper case had evolved from a local tragedy into a national symbol of the dangers posed by violent offenders, the importance of community vigilance, and the power of survivors' advocacy. Law enforcement agencies, legislative bodies, and educators cited the case in trainings, policy proposals, and community programs. The Harpers' courage in speaking publicly about their experiences created a platform for change, encouraging legislative reform, community engagement, and educational outreach on violence prevention. In reflection, the Waukesha Harper case stands as a chilling reminder of the potential for calculated violence to devastate lives and communities. It also serves as a testament to human resilience. The ability to transform grief into action, to rebuild after unimaginable loss, and to find purpose in the aftermath of tragedy. Michael and Elaine Harper, through their advocacy, charitable work, and personal determination, ensured that the memory of Lily and Grace would endure, not merely as victims of a horrific crime, but as inspirations for a safer, more vigilant society. The story of the Harpers, while deeply tragic, ultimately became a story of courage, justice, and the capacity of individuals and communities to rise from darkness and effect meaningful change. Their journey illustrated the fragility of life, the consequences of unchecked criminal behavior, and the enduring importance of resilience, empathy, and proactive action in the face of tragedy. Story 5. On a crisp spring morning in October 2015, the serene coastal town of Torquay, Victoria, was buzzing with its usual rhythm of surfers, tourists, and local shopkeepers preparing for the weekend. It was the kind of town where neighbors knew each other by name, where children rode their bikes without fear, and where life moved at a gentle pace. But beneath the sun-drenched beaches and quiet streets, a storm was quietly brewing, one that would shatter a family and leave an entire community grappling with horror. The Harrison family lived on Seaview Crescent, a modest but beautifully kept home perched on a slight hill overlooking the ocean. Nathan Harrison, 42 years old, was a marine biologist who had devoted his life to studying local wildlife. Known for his gentle demeanor and dedication to conservation, Nathan had earned respect both within his professional community and among the residents of Torquay. His wife, Emma Harrison, 40, was a high school teacher with a reputation for warmth, compassion, and a fierce commitment to her students. Together, they had built a life defined by love, stability, and shared dreams. Their children were the center of their world. Sophie Harrison, age 16, was a promising young athlete and academic, excelling in swimming competitions and serving as captain of her school's environmental club. She was poised, confident, and beloved by peers and teachers alike. Her younger brother, 12-year-old Liam Harrison, was an adventurous, creative child with a love for photography and storytelling. Known for his infectious laughter and boundless curiosity, Liam often accompanied his father on marine research trips, documenting local wildlife through his lens. The Harrison family had been planning a small weekend getaway to the nearby Otway Ranges. Emma and Nathan had promised Sophie and Liam a day of hiking and wildlife spotting, a brief escape from the pressures of school, work, and everyday life. Little did they know, their plans for a peaceful family outing would coincide with the beginning of a nightmare orchestrated by a man who had been watching them from the shadows. Daniel Frost, 35, lived in a rented apartment on the outskirts of Torquay. He had a long history of criminal behavior, including burglary, assault, and repeated encounters with the criminal justice system. Frost's early life had been marked by instability, a turbulent childhood, periods in juvenile detention, and a string of failed relationships and employment attempts. Over time, his grievances with society had grown into a dangerous combination of entitlement, anger, and distorted reasoning. Frost's criminal record had often kept him under parole supervision, but lapses in monitoring allowed him to roam freely at the time he fixated on the Harrison family. On the morning of October 10, 2015, Frost observed Emma and Liam leaving for school, noting their routines, the times they departed, and their interactions. Later, he followed Nathan as he left for work, mapping the entrances and exits of the family home. Frost's intentions were far from spontaneous. This was a meticulously planned operation, executed with patience and chilling calculation. By the evening, the family returned from their daily activities, unaware that someone had already studied their movements, their habits, and their vulnerabilities. The tranquility of Seaview Crescent belied the danger that lurked. Frost had chosen this night to make his move, exploiting the shadows of dusk and the limited visibility of the street's narrow lanes. He approached the Harrison home, ensuring that no neighbors were watching, and quietly breached a rear door using a crowbar he had obtained days prior. Inside, Frost methodically moved through the house, aware of the layout and the locations of the family members he had surveilled. Nathan was preparing dinner in the kitchen, while Emma helped Liam with his homework at the dining table. Sophie had retreated to her room, headphones on, absorbed in music. Frost's presence went unnoticed until it was too late. With the element of surprise, he quickly subdued Nathan, striking him with a blunt object he had brought to ensure compliance. Emma attempted to intervene, but Frost's physical advantage allowed him to immobilize her as well. He forced the family into the living room, binding their wrists and gagging them. Using psychological intimidation, he demanded that Nathan and Emma disclose the locations of cash, valuables, and safe combinations. Frost's demeanor combined calculated menace with moments of deceptive calm, creating a terrifying environment for the Harrison family. For over an hour, he interrogated them, moving through rooms, checking cupboards, and scanning for hidden assets. Every noise outside, a passing car, a barking dog, caused him to momentarily pause, his paranoia heightening the terror within the house. Meanwhile, Sophie attempted to silently reach her phone in her bedroom, hoping to call for help. Frost noticed her movement and immediately restrained her, threatening harm if she attempted to alert authorities. Liam, witnessing the unfolding chaos, tried to hide under a table, but Frost found him and brought him into the room. The family, terrified and overwhelmed, were trapped under the control of a man whose focus was ruthlessly singular: gain, control, and an assertion of dominance over lives he deemed expendable. The first signs of escalation came when Frost discovered the family's emergency funds. He demanded that Nathan and Emma withdraw money from their bank accounts, similar to instructions he had observed in prior criminal patterns. This required leaving the house, and Frost prepared to take Emma as a hostage to enforce compliance. He was methodical, reviewing the risks of being seen in the neighborhood, the possibility of bystanders witnessing the act, and the timing necessary to prevent detection. The clock ticked on and the night deepened, the sense of dread compounded by the isolation of Seaview Crescent. Frost's plan, while premeditated, was dynamic, adapting to obstacles and unexpected movements by the family. The psychological strain on Nathan, Emma, Sophie, and Liam was immense, each aware that one misstep could provoke violence. Frost's calm, calculating nature amplified the terror, as the family realized that this was not a random burglary. This was a deliberate attack, targeting them specifically. By midnight, Frost had coerced Nathan into retrieving funds, all the while maintaining control over the other family members. Surveillance by neighbors was minimal, and no immediate threats to Frost's freedom emerged. The Harrison family, bound, gagged, and psychologically terrorized, had no external recourse. For hours, Frost's presence dominated the household, shifting from interrogation to intimidation, testing boundaries and asserting control over life and death. As the clock approached 1:00 a.m., the tension inside the Harrison home reached a breaking point. Frost had secured all exits, ensuring that no one could leave or call for help. The family, restrained and terrified, could only watch as he moved through the rooms, his eyes scanning for any valuables he had previously observed during his days of surveillance. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains, was magnified into an ominous warning. Nathan Harrison, despite being restrained and injured from earlier strikes, remained mentally focused. He quietly observed Frost's movements, attempting to memorize the layout and the intruder's behavior. Nathan's years of scientific training had taught him the value of patience and observation, even in stressful conditions. He whispered reassurances to Emma, though his voice trembled, hoping to calm her panic and that of their children. Frost's behavior oscillated between methodical calculation and bursts of violent aggression. He frequently threatened the family, raising his voice and swinging the blunt object he carried, making it clear that resistance would be met with immediate and severe consequences. He demanded precise information regarding cash, jewelry, and bank accounts. The family complied, providing the details he requested, though the amounts he was shown were limited compared to his expectations. Frost's frustration began to grow, and his mental state appeared increasingly unstable. Around 2:00 a.m., Frost decided to escalate the situation further. Drawing on methods he had read about in criminal case studies, he separated Sophie and Liam from their parents, confining them to Sophie's bedroom. He forced them to lie face down on the floor, binding them tightly with duct tape. The children's muffled cries and attempts to resist were met with harsh threats. Frost explained, in a chillingly calm voice, that the situation would end only if their parents fully complied with his demands. Nathan and Emma, meanwhile, were being coerced into providing access to their financial accounts. Frost had brought with him a tablet and a mobile hotspot, tools he had researched and prepared in advance. He instructed Nathan to log into online banking portals and transfer funds into accounts Frost controlled. Nathan complied, hoping that by meeting these demands, he could preserve his family's lives. Each transaction Nathan completed felt like a small victory for survival, though he was acutely aware that Frost's intentions were unlikely to be limited to theft. As the night progressed, Frost's aggression escalated further. He began making veiled threats against the children, referencing the surveillance he had conducted and the knowledge he had gained about their routines. His psychological manipulation was designed to break the family's spirit, instill fear, and ensure absolute compliance. Sophie, despite her terror, tried to maintain composure for her younger brother, whispering reassurances and attempting to project strength beyond her years. By 3:30 a.m., Frost had decided that the next phase of his plan required moving the family into separate areas to maintain control. He dragged Nathan into a small storage room while forcing Emma, Sophie, and Liam into the living room. He placed himself strategically between them, ensuring that any attempt to flee would be met with immediate physical consequences. This spatial control reinforced his dominance and limited the family's ability to coordinate or seek assistance. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Frost, a neighbor named Corinne Willis had noticed suspicious activity outside the Harrison home earlier in the evening. She had seen a figure lurking near the driveway and had become increasingly concerned when she observed movement inside the home after dark. However, uncertainty and fear of misjudgment delayed her decision to call authorities immediately. The isolation of Seaview Crescent, coupled with the quiet of the night, allowed Frost to operate undetected. At 4:15 a.m., Frost escalated his threats. He revealed a small container of accelerant he had brought, a tactic intended to amplify fear and assert control. He made it clear that any resistance would result in catastrophic consequences. The sight of the accelerant created a tangible sense of imminent danger, pushing the Harrison family into a state of sheer panic. Nathan, realizing the severity of the threat, began formulating a plan in his mind. He understood that survival required both patience and seizing the precise moment to act. Around 4:45 a.m., Frost attempted to compel Emma to contact a local ATM to withdraw additional funds. He threatened to harm Sophie and Liam if she did not comply immediately. Emma, terrified but resourceful, feigned confusion and delay, buying precious minutes for Nathan to assess the situation and search for any potential means of escape. Frost grew increasingly agitated with the perceived delay, swinging between frustration and rage. Sophie, observing Frost's agitation, whispered to Liam to stay calm and quiet. She had noticed that Frost's attention shifted frequently, and she understood that patience could create opportunities. The children's ability to remain silent, coupled with Nathan and Emma's cooperation, kept the family alive for the time being. Every second was a test of endurance, courage, and strategic thinking under extreme duress. At 5:30 a.m., Frost attempted to further intimidate the family by demonstrating his capability for violence. He struck a household object against the wall, producing a loud noise that reverberated through the home. The children screamed, and Emma tried to intervene, only to be restrained more tightly. Frost's psychological tactics were effective in keeping the family compliant, reinforcing his control over the environment and their actions. By early morning, around 6:00 a.m., Frost had begun preparing for the final phase of his plan. He forced Nathan to unlock the safe in the study, extracting cash, jewelry, and important documents. He then gathered tools and implements, seemingly preparing for either departure or escalation. His movements were precise, yet tense, suggesting both confidence in his plan and an underlying fear of detection. At this critical juncture, the sound of a vehicle approaching the driveway changed the dynamics of the situation. Frost, hearing an unfamiliar car, temporarily redirected his attention toward the door. The Harrison family realized that outside assistance might be imminent, and the prospect of intervention sparked a surge of hope. Frost, however, quickly regained composure, brandishing his weapon and warning the family against attempting any communication with outsiders. By 6:15 a.m., Frost had made a critical decision. He would attempt to control the situation entirely within the home, preventing any external interference. He moved the family into the basement, confining them to a single room and reinforcing restraints. His actions demonstrated premeditation, adaptability, and a willingness to escalate violence if necessary. The Harrison family, now concentrated in one space, faced the heightened risk of physical and psychological harm, yet they remained determined to survive. By dawn, the situation had reached a climax of fear, tension, and uncertainty. Frost, armed with knowledge, tools, and a distorted sense of purpose, controlled the home and its inhabitants. Nathan, Emma, Sophie, and Liam remained bound, yet their resilience, strategic thinking, and unity had prevented immediate catastrophe. Outside, the world continued unaware of the horrors unfolding within the walls of Seaview Crescent, while the first hints of daylight began to seep into the house, illuminating the stakes and the peril faced by the Harrison family. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test courage, resourcefulness, and the limits of human endurance. By mid-morning, the Harrison family had endured over 7 hours of relentless fear, psychological manipulation, and physical restraint. The basement, dimly lit and cluttered with old storage boxes, had become their prison. Nathan, despite bruises and fatigue, continued to scan the environment for any opportunities to escape. Emma, Sophie, and Liam huddled together, drawing strength from one another, whispering quiet encouragements and prayers in hopes that help would arrive before the situation escalated further. Meanwhile, Frost had moved on to a new phase of his plan. He began systematically searching the house for additional valuables while maintaining surveillance of the basement. He had anticipated that any attempt to flee or alert authorities would require immediate and violent intervention. Frost's meticulous planning was evident. He had studied the layout of the home, the family's routines, and even potential escape routes. His preparation demonstrated both premeditation and a cold, methodical approach to criminal violence. At approximately 9:00 a.m., Frost's attention was drawn to the arrival of emergency personnel. A neighbor, Mrs. Karen Willis, finally decided to call Zero, Australia's emergency number, after observing suspicious behavior over the previous evening and early morning. She reported a man acting erratically near the Harrison residence, mentioning a possible break-in. Law enforcement officers were dispatched immediately. Frost, upon hearing sirens in the distance, knew that time was no longer on his side. Panic flickered across his otherwise composed demeanor. He returned to the basement, ensuring that the family remained restrained. Nathan realized that the intruder's confidence was cracking, creating a potential opening for escape. Subtly, he assessed the bindings on his hands and ankles, noting points of weakness that could be exploited if an opportunity presented itself. By 9:30 a.m., officers from the New South Wales police force had arrived in the quiet suburban street. Uniformed officers and detectives cautiously approached the residence, establishing a perimeter and attempting to make contact with Frost. Initial attempts to communicate through the front door were met with silence. Frost, realizing the situation was rapidly deteriorating, fortified the interior and threatened the family, warning them not to make a sound. Inside the basement, tension reached its peak. Nathan quietly signaled to Emma that she and the children should remain calm, emphasizing the importance of waiting for a precise moment. The family, understanding the gravity of the situation, followed his lead, controlling their fear and movements as best they could. The hours of planning, psychological manipulation, and terror had honed Frost's control, but the strain of anticipation and the presence of law enforcement outside began to affect him. At 10:00 a.m., Frost made a critical error. Believing he could negotiate or delay police intervention, he allowed Nathan brief access to a small utility knife left unattended in the basement. Frost did not anticipate that Nathan would use it to begin loosening his restraints. Slowly and quietly, Nathan worked to free his hands, careful to avoid attracting Frost's attention. Every second felt like an eternity, with the family's lives hanging in the balance. By 10:20 a.m., Nathan had freed himself enough to quietly cut Emma's restraints. He whispered instructions, guiding her and the children in maintaining silence while he worked to free them all. Frost, absorbed in organizing stolen items and checking escape routes, did not notice the subtle movements below. The meticulous control he had exercised for hours began to slip, marking a turning point in the standoff. At 10:35 a.m., police officers attempted a second approach, this time using tactical measures to encourage communication. Frost, hearing voices and footsteps, grew increasingly agitated. He issued threats toward the basement, warning the family that any attempt to escape would result in immediate harm. Nathan, observing Frost's agitation, realized that timing was critical. The family's survival depended on maintaining calm until law enforcement could intervene directly. At 10:45 a.m., Nathan had fully freed himself and began cutting Sophie and Liam's restraints. Emma followed suit, freeing herself and assisting the children. Every movement was deliberate and controlled, minimizing noise while maximizing the potential for a coordinated escape. The family's ability to remain composed under extreme stress reflected both courage and the strategic thinking Nathan had employed throughout the ordeal. By 11:00 a.m., Frost attempted to exit the house, likely intending to confront law enforcement or flee. In doing so, he exposed himself to tactical units stationed outside. Police officers, prepared for a violent encounter, moved quickly to secure the perimeter and prevent escape. Frost realized he was trapped, his meticulously planned crime unraveling in real time. At 11:05 a.m., Nathan seized the opportunity. He guided his family toward a small rear window in the basement, one he had noted during earlier observations. With effort and coordination, they managed to climb through, emerging into the backyard. Police officers immediately moved in, providing safety and directing the family to a secure location. The sight of uniformed officers reassured the family that their ordeal was nearing its end. Frost, now fully aware that his plan had failed, attempted to flee toward the front of the house. Officers quickly intercepted him. A tense standoff ensued, but Frost, exhausted, psychologically destabilized, and outnumbered, eventually surrendered without further violence. Tactical units quickly secured the interior of the home, ensuring that no further threats remained. Inside the Harrison residence, law enforcement and forensic teams began documenting the scene. The basement bore evidence of prolonged restraint and psychological abuse, bindings, duct tape, and signs of struggle. Frost had also caused property damage in his attempt to control and intimidate the family. The recovery process was methodical, ensuring that all physical evidence was preserved for subsequent investigation and trial. In the hours following the rescue, the Harrison family was transported to a local hospital for medical evaluation. Nathan and Emma received treatment for bruises, cuts, and minor trauma, while Sophie and Liam were checked for both physical injuries and psychological impact. Mental health professionals provided immediate support, recognizing the need for early intervention in cases of severe trauma. By late afternoon, the story of the Harrison home invasion began spreading across local media outlets. News reports highlighted the bravery of Nathan, Emma, and their children, as well as the swift and effective response by New South Wales law enforcement. The community reacted with shock and empathy, organizing support networks and ensuring that the family would have resources to recover from the ordeal. Investigators quickly built a comprehensive timeline of Frost's actions, corroborated by witness accounts, surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and the family's testimony. Phone records, social media activity, and digital footprints confirmed premeditation. Frost had conducted surveillance over several days, studied the family's routines, and brought tools specifically for restraint, intimidation, and theft. It became clear that Frost's intent extended beyond robbery. Psychological control, humiliation, and prolonged fear were integral components of his plan. Law enforcement also uncovered evidence that Frost had attempted similar crimes in the weeks leading up to the Harrison invasion, suggesting a pattern of escalating violence. As the investigation progressed, authorities emphasized the importance of community vigilance, reporting suspicious behavior, and early intervention. Frost's apprehension highlighted both the effectiveness of coordinated police response and the risks posed by individuals with prior criminal records who escalate to more violent offenses. The months following the Harrison home invasion were filled with investigations, legal preparations, and media scrutiny. Frost was formally charged with multiple offenses, including aggravated burglary, kidnapping, assault, psychological torture, and attempted murder. Each charge carried significant penalties under New South Wales law, reflecting the severity and premeditated nature of his actions. The trial began 6 months after the attack. Prosecutors presented a compelling case: physical evidence from the Harrison residence, forensic analysis of bindings and household damage, surveillance footage from neighbors, and, critically, testimony from Nathan and Emma Harrison. The prosecution emphasized premeditation, pointing out Frost's prior criminal record and the meticulous planning that went into the invasion. Phone records, text messages, and internet activity demonstrated that Frost had selected the Harrison family specifically, monitored their routines, and brought tools with him to maximize control and fear. Defense attorneys attempted to mitigate Frost's responsibility, citing alleged mental health struggles and a difficult upbringing. They argued that Frost's actions were influenced by psychological instability rather than pure malice. However, the overwhelming evidence and the family's credible testimony undermined these claims. The jury listened intently as Nathan recounted the hours of terror in the basement, the subtle coordination with his wife and children, and the moment they finally escaped. Emma described both the physical and psychological trauma endured by the family, emphasizing the long-term impact of Frost's actions. Sophie and Liam provided statements about their experiences, demonstrating remarkable courage in recounting events despite the emotional toll. Over the course of the 3-week trial, the prosecution systematically dismantled the defense. Forensic experts testified about the psychological effects of prolonged restraint and intimidation, noting that Frost's behavior had been calculated to maximize terror. Neighbors' testimonies corroborated the timeline of events, and digital evidence established Frost's surveillance and preparation. By the time closing arguments were delivered, the jury had an almost complete understanding of the scope, intent, and brutality of the crime. On the final day of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict, guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted with a mix of relief and solemnity. Judge Margaret Cole acknowledged the severity of the crime, describing it as a meticulously planned assault on innocence, designed to terrorize a family and destabilize a community. Sentencing was scheduled 1 month later. During the hearing, the prosecution requested the maximum allowable penalties, emphasizing the lasting psychological impact on the Harrison family and the necessity of protecting the public from similar threats. Frost's defense attempted to argue for a reduced sentence, citing his background and alleged remorse. Judge Cole, however, rejected these pleas. The sentence was a life term without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for aggravated assault and kidnapping counts. The court noted that Frost's actions were deliberate, calculated, and extraordinarily harmful, leaving no room for leniency. While the legal process concluded with a clear measure of justice, the Harrison family faced a long journey of recovery. Nathan and Emma sought both medical and psychological support for themselves and their children. Trauma therapy became an essential part of daily life, helping the family process the events and rebuild a sense of safety. Support groups for victims of violent crime provided guidance, resources, and a sense of community that helped mitigate isolation and anxiety. The family also became active advocates for home safety, public awareness, and criminal justice reform. Nathan spoke at community forums about the importance of early reporting, neighborhood vigilance, and cooperative law enforcement. Emma focused on outreach for survivors of violent crime, emphasizing resilience and the psychological strategies that had helped her family survive the ordeal. Sophie and Liam, inspired by their parents' efforts, participated in school programs promoting personal safety, community awareness, and emotional coping skills. Beyond local advocacy, the Harrison family's story prompted broader discussions in Australia about the monitoring of repeat offenders, parole system evaluations, and preventive measures to protect vulnerable communities. Media coverage highlighted both the horror of the crime and the remarkable courage displayed by the family, shaping public discourse on safety, accountability, and survivor empowerment. 5 years after the attack, Nathan and Emma worked to create the Harrison Foundation for Family Safety, an organization dedicated to supporting victims of violent crime, promoting home security measures, and offering counseling resources. The foundation also collaborated with law enforcement to develop educational programs aimed at reducing domestic vulnerability to violent intrusions. Despite ongoing therapy and advocacy work, the family continued to experience the psychological aftereffects of Frost's attack. Nightmares, anxiety, and heightened vigilance were common, but the experience had also fostered resilience, unity, and a commitment to helping others. The Harrisons' ability to transform tragedy into purposeful action became a symbol of hope and courage in the face of premeditated criminal violence. Ultimately, the Harrison case stands as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked aggression, the critical importance of community awareness, and the capacity for human resilience. Frost, confined for life, represents the danger posed by meticulous and violent intent, while the Harrisons exemplify courage, strategic thinking, and the enduring power of family bonds. The story of the Harrison family continues to resonate across Australia, inspiring educational initiatives, public safety campaigns, and ongoing discussions about justice, victim advocacy, and the prevention of violent crime. Their survival is a testament not only to their bravery, but also to the importance of timely law enforcement intervention, community support, and the human capacity for recovery in the aftermath of unspeakable terror. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Midnight. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious,